There are moments when everything seems to resist. Plans collapse without warning. Effort produces nothing. Clarity dissolves into confusion. And the harder you push, the more the system pushes back. This is not bad luck. This is not a test of character. This is what happens when frequency is wrong. Tesla observed this in systems long before most people understood that systems had frequency. He watched machines fail, not because they were poorly built, but because one component vibrated at a rate that canceled the work of another. He watched structures collapse, not because they were weak, but because the forces inside them moved in opposition. And he watched people exhaust themselves trying to control outcomes that could only organize when the underlying signal was corrected. The promise of this series is not that you will learn to force order. The promise is that you will recognize the frequency condition under which order assembles itself. And once that frequency is understood, resistance does not need to be overcome. It disappears. Disorder is not random. It follows rules. When a system operates at conflicting frequencies, the result is predictable. Energy dissipates, structures destabilize, outcomes fragment. This is not punishment. This is physics. Tesla did not moralize about why things failed. He measured the interference and corrected it. And the moment the interference was removed, the system stabilized without further input. Most people never reach this point. They experience disorder and assume the problem is external. They believe the task is too difficult, the circumstances too hostile, the goal too distant. But the task is not difficult. The frequency is incoherent. And incoherence does not resolve through effort. It resolves through alignment. Alignment is not something you add to a system. It is what remains when contradiction is removed. Tesla did not add complexity to his designs. He eliminated everything that did not serve the governing frequency, and what remained functioned exactly as the law required. The sensation most people call struggle is not effort. It is friction. Friction occurs when two forces oppose each other within the same system. If your thoughts move in one direction and your beliefs move in another, you have created friction. If your words declare one intention and your actions reinforce a different pattern, you have introduced opposition. The system does not resolve this opposition by choosing the stronger force. It processes the entire transmission as noise. And noise does not produce work. It produces heat. Heat is energy that does not translate into movement. It is the exhaustion you feel at the end of a day where nothing changed. Tesla understood that heat was a symptom of misalignment. When his systems ran hot, he did not add cooling. He adjusted the design. He corrected the frequency, and the heat disappeared because the opposition that caused it no longer existed. Most people do the opposite. They experience friction and apply more force. They push harder. They work longer, and the friction increases proportionally. Because the problem was never force. The problem was frequency. Tesla spent years studying resonance. Resonance is what happens when a system is driven at its natural frequency. The system does not resist. It amplifies. A small input produces a large output, not because the input is strong, but because the input is aligned. When the input is misaligned, even enormous force produces minimal result. This is why some people achieve outcomes that seem effortless, while others labor without progress. The difference is not talent, it is not discipline, it is resonance. And resonance cannot be forced. It can only be tuned. Tuning requires observation. It requires the ability to detect where the system is resisting and why. Most people never observe this. They feel the resistance and assume it is inevitable. They accept that life is hard, that progress is slow, that results require suffering. But none of this is law. It is simply the predictable outcome of operating at the wrong frequency. And the moment the frequency is corrected, the resistance dissolves. Order is not imposed. It is revealed. When a system operates at the correct frequency, order appears automatically. Not because someone arranged it, but because the system has no other stable state. Tesla did not force his inventions to function. He arranged conditions so that natural law could operate without obstruction. He removed interference. He eliminated contradiction. And the system organized itself according to principles that were already present. Most people believe that order requires constant maintenance. They believe that without effort, everything will fall apart. But this belief itself is a form of interference. It assumes that the natural state of things is chaos, and that assumption creates the very disorder it fears. The natural state of energy is not chaos. It is pattern. Energy organizes into the most stable configuration available. If the configuration is incoherent, energy will reorganize until it finds coherence. And once coherence is achieved, the system stabilizes without further input. This is not hope. This is thermodynamics. The question is not whether order is possible. The question is whether you are transmitting the frequency that allows it. Every thought you hold is a signal. Every belief you repeat is a transmission. If those signals are aligned, the system responds by organizing around them. If those signals are contradictory, the system experiences interference. And interference does not resolve itself through wishful thinking. It resolves through correction. Correction begins with observation. You must see where the contradiction exists. Not in vague terms, but precisely. Where does your thinking oppose your stated goal? Where does your behavior contradict your declared intention? Where does your attention return when no one is watching? These are not philosophical questions. They are diagnostic, and the answers reveal the frequency you are actually transmitting, not the frequency you wish you were transmitting, not the frequency you believe you are transmitting, but the one the system is responding to, and the system always responds to what is, not to what is claimed. Tesla did not begin with action. He began with clarity. He defined the outcome. He identified the governing frequency. He eliminated everything that interfered with that frequency. Only then did he act. And when he acted, the result was not uncertain. It was inevitable, because the conditions for success had already been established. Most people reverse this sequence. They act first. They apply effort without understanding the system they are operating within. They scatter energy across conflicting goals and wonder why nothing stabilizes. The system is not punishing them. The system is responding exactly as it must. Energy flows where structure permits. If the structure is incoherent, the energy dissipates. If the structure is aligned, the energy accumulates and produces visible results. This is not a reward for good behavior. This is cause and effect, and cause always precedes effect. You cannot change the effect without first changing the cause, and the cause is always frequency. When disorder persists, it is not because the universe is hostile. It is because the frequency you are transmitting is incoherent. Incoherence does not produce random results. It produces predictable ones. Delay, friction, collapse. These are not signs that you are on the wrong path. They are signs that the signal is unclear. And an unclear signal does not become clear through repetition. It becomes clear through correction. Correction requires honesty. Not emotional honesty, but structural honesty. You must be willing to see where you are holding two opposing frequencies simultaneously, where you are declaring one thing while believing another, where you are acting in a way that contradicts the outcome you claim to want. These contradictions are not moral failures. They are engineering problems. And engineering problems have engineering solutions. You do not fix them by trying harder. You fix them by eliminating the interference. And the moment the interference is removed, the system responds. Not because you earned it, because the law requires it. Tesla understood that reality is not fixed. Reality is responsive. It responds to frequency. When frequency is coherent, reality organizes to match it. When frequency is incoherent, reality reflects that incoherence. This is not mystical, it is mechanical. A radio does not create the signal, it tunes to the signal. When the tuning is precise, the transmission is clear. When the tuning is off, there is static. Your mind operates the same way. It does not generate outcomes. It tunes to frequencies. And the frequency you hold most consistently is the frequency the system amplifies. If you hold disorder, the system reflects disorder. If you hold coherence, the system reflects coherence. The reflection is immediate, but most people do not notice, because they are not observing their signal. They are reacting to noise, and reaction is itself a form of interference. It compounds the incoherence, instead of resolving it. Tesla did not react, he observed. And through observation, he identified the precise point where alignment was lost. And he corrected it, not with force, with precision. The system is not waiting for you to become worthy. It is waiting for you to become coherent. Coherence is not a virtue, it is a condition, and it is the only condition under which order can emerge. When coherence is established, events begin to organize without management. Opportunities appear without force. Problems resolve without intervention. Not because you are lucky, because the system has stabilized. And a stable system does not require constant adjustment. It maintains itself. Tesla knew this. He did not spend his time managing outcomes. He spent his time maintaining frequency. And once the frequency was correct, the outcomes organized themselves. This is the pattern most people never see. They focus on the result and ignore the signal. They try to change what appears without changing what transmits. And the result, predictably, remains unchanged. Because the system does not respond to effort, it responds to frequency. And frequency is not something you apply. It is something you are. Or more precisely, it is something you hold. And what you hold determines what the system reflects. Not eventually, immediately. The delay you experience is not the system taking time to respond. It is you taking time to recognize that the response has already begun. The moment disorder is seen not as a problem to solve but as a signal to correct. Everything changes. Not because the circumstances change but because the observer changes. And the observer is the transmitter. When the transmitter corrects the signal, the system has no choice but to reorganize. This is not faith. This is not hope. This is law. And law does not negotiate. It simply operates. Tesla did not hope his systems would work. He knew they would work because he had aligned every variable with the governing principle, and the principle, once understood, removes all uncertainty. There is no question of whether it will work. There is only the question of whether the frequency is correct. And if the frequency is correct, the result is not in doubt. It is inevitable, because the system cannot behave any other way. Order does not emerge from effort. It emerges from alignment. And alignment is not a destination. It is a frequency, and frequency, once mastered, makes everything else automatic. Every system seeks its most stable configuration. When internal variables conflict, the system remains unstable. When internal variables align, stability is not forced, it is revealed. And once revealed, it does not require maintenance, it requires only that the frequency be held. The law operates without exception. No circumstance overrides it, no belief suspends it, no effort compensates for its absence, and no result appears outside of it. Order emerges when frequency is correct. Most people do not see the cost of misalignment until it has compounded beyond recognition. They notice the exhaustion. They notice the stagnation. They notice that outcomes no longer match effort, but they do not trace these effects back to their source. The source is not external. It is not circumstance. It is not timing. The source is interference. And interference is not loud. It does not announce itself. It operates quietly in the background of every thought, every decision, every action that contradicts the frequency you claim to hold. Tesla understood that small deviations accumulate. A system that is off by 1 degree will drift further from alignment with every cycle. And after 10,000 cycles, the destination is unrecognizable. This is why most people cannot connect their current state to the choices that produced it. The choices were not dramatic, they were incremental, and the misalignment was not visible until the distance became undeniable. The cost of misalignment is not paid once, it is paid continuously. Every day you operate at the wrong frequency, the system extracts a toll. Energy is spent without producing movement. Attention is consumed without generating clarity. Effort is applied without creating progress. And the toll increases over time, not because the system becomes more hostile, but because misalignment compounds. A thought repeated becomes a pattern. A pattern repeated becomes a structure, and a structure once established governs every subsequent action. Tesla did not allow patterns to form unconsciously. He observed where his attention moved. He monitored where his thinking deviated, and he corrected deviations immediately. Not because he feared failure, but because he understood that correction becomes exponentially more costly the longer it is delayed. A small adjustment made early requires minimal effort. The same adjustment made after months of drift requires complete reconstruction. Most people tolerate contradiction as if it were normal. They say they want clarity while maintaining confusion. They say they want progress while reinforcing the conditions that prevent it. They say they want peace while feeding conflict. And the system, which does not interpret intention, responds to what is transmitted most consistently. Not to what is declared, not to what is hoped, but to what is held. And what is held is almost always fragmented. This fragmentation is not accidental. It is structural. Every belief that contradicts your stated goal is a point of interference. Every action that opposes your declared direction is a source of drag. And every moment of attention spent on what you do not want is a transmission that reinforces the very pattern you claim to reject. The system does not parse nuance. It amplifies signal. And if the signal is contradictory, the amplification produces noise. Noise is not just absence of clarity, it is active disorder. And disorder does not resolve itself. It intensifies until the contradiction is addressed. Tesla observed that energy does not wait for permission to flow. It flows immediately along the path of least resistance. If you create a clear path, energy organizes into work. If you create obstruction, energy dissipates into heat. The same principle applies to thought. When your thinking is coherent, energy moves in one direction. It compounds. It produces results. But when your thinking is incoherent, energy scatters. It moves in multiple directions simultaneously. And the directions cancel each other out. The result is not progress. The result is exhaustion. You feel like you are working. You feel like you are trying. But the system is not responding because the system is receiving conflicting instructions. And conflicting instructions do not produce partial results. They produce no results, because the energy required to move in one direction is being consumed by the energy required to move in another, and what remains is not enough to produce visible change. The hidden cost of misalignment is not just what you fail to achieve, it is what you actively dismantle. Every day you operate at the wrong frequency, you are not simply failing to build. You are eroding what already exists. Confidence erodes, clarity erodes, momentum erodes, and the erosion is not dramatic, it is gradual. You do not notice it happening because each day feels mostly the same. But the cumulative effect is collapse, not sudden collapse, but slow disintegration. And by the time you recognize it, the structure is too weak to support the outcome you originally intended. Tesla did not allow erosion. He maintained his systems. He observed drift. He corrected deviation. And he understood that maintenance is not something you do after the system is built. Maintenance is something you do continuously. Because the forces that produce misalignment do not stop. They operate constantly. And if you are not correcting them, they are compounding. How often do you act against your stated priority? This is not a question of morality. It is a question of measurement. If you say one thing matters most, and then spend your time on something else, you have introduced a contradiction, and the system does not care which statement is true. It responds to what you do, not to what you say, not to what you intend, but to what you repeat. And what you repeat is almost always what you do not consciously choose. It is the default pattern, the habit, the automatic response. And the automatic response is where misalignment lives. Tesla did not operate on autopilot. He observed his own behavior with the same precision he applied to his machines. He noticed where his attention drifted. He noticed where his thinking became unclear, and he corrected it immediately, not because he judged himself, but because he understood that uncorrected drift always leads to failure, and failure was not a moral outcome, it was a mechanical one. Misalignment does not produce random consequences. It produces specific, predictable ones. Delay is one. When the signal is unclear, the system does not know which outcome to organize toward, so it organizes toward none. The result is stagnation, not because you are not trying, but because the system is receiving instructions that cancel each other out. Friction is another. When your actions oppose your stated goal, every step forward requires 10 times the effort it would require if the signal were aligned. And exhaustion is the third. When energy is spent without producing movement, the sensation is not rest, it is depletion. You feel drained not because you worked hard, but because you worked against yourself. And working against yourself is the most expensive form of effort, because it consumes energy without producing any outcome that moves you closer to what you claim to want. Tesla avoided this entirely. He did not waste energy, he did not tolerate misalignment, and he did not continue acting when he detected interference. He stopped, he corrected, and only then did he proceed. Most people assume that the cost of misalignment is temporary. They believe that if they push through, the problem will resolve itself. But misalignment does not resolve through persistence. It worsens through persistence. Because every action taken from a misaligned state reinforces the misalignment. The pattern deepens, the structure solidifies, and eventually the misaligned state becomes the baseline. At that point, aligned action feels foreign. It feels uncomfortable. It feels wrong. Not because it is wrong, but because the system has organized around incoherence. And coherence, when introduced into an incoherent system, is experienced as disruption. This is why most people resist the very changes that would free them. The changes feel like loss. They feel like sacrifice. But they are not. They are correction. And correction always feels uncomfortable to a system that has adapted to dysfunction. Tesla understood this. He did not mistake discomfort for wrongness. He recognized discomfort as the signal that adjustment was occurring, and he allowed the adjustment to complete. The cost of misalignment is not visible on the first day. It is not visible on the 10th day. It becomes visible only after the pattern has repeated long enough to produce a result that cannot be ignored. And by then, the cost is no longer small. It is structural. It affects every area. Not because the areas are connected, but because the frequency is unified. The frequency you hold in one domain is the frequency you hold in every domain. If you tolerate contradiction in your thinking, you will tolerate contradiction in your behavior. If you accept incoherence in your speech, you will accept incoherence in your actions. And the system, which operates as a whole, will reflect that incoherence everywhere. Tesla did not compartmentalize. He did not allow disorder in one area while expecting order in another. He understood that frequency is not local, it is systemic. And a systemic problem requires a systemic correction. You cannot fix the result without fixing the signal, and you cannot fix the signal without first admitting that it is wrong. The longer misalignment persists, the more normal it feels. And the more normal it feels, the less likely you are to correct it. This is the trap. Misalignment does not feel like misalignment once it has been normalized. It feels like reality. And once it feels like reality, any suggestion that it could be different feels like fantasy. But reality is not fixed. Reality is responsive, and it responds to frequency. The frequency you have held for years has produced the reality you now inhabit. And if you want a different reality, you must transmit a different frequency. Not someday, not after conditions improve, but now, because the system is always responding. It is responding in this moment, and the signal it is responding to is the signal you are transmitting right now, not the signal you transmitted yesterday, not the signal you plan to transmit tomorrow, but the one you are holding in this instant. And if that signal is incoherent, the response will be incoherent, not because the system is broken, because the system is functioning exactly as it must. Tesla did not wait for alignment to feel easy. He aligned first. And once alignment was established, ease followed, not as a reward, but as a consequence. This is the sequence most people reverse. They wait for ease before they commit to alignment. They wait for proof before they eliminate contradiction. But the system does not offer proof to those who remain misaligned. It offers proof to those who align first. And the proof appears not through belief, but through observation. Once the signal is corrected, the response changes. Not gradually, immediately. The system reorganizes the moment coherence is established. And the reorganization is not subtle. It is visible, tangible, undeniable. But it cannot occur while the signal remains fragmented. And the signal will remain fragmented until the contradiction is seen, named, and removed. This is not difficult. It is precise. And precision is not something you hope for. It is something you practice, every day, in every moment, until the aligned state is no longer effortful, until it is automatic, until it is the only state you know. Every unresolved contradiction is a frequency pulling against your stated direction. Every uncorrected misalignment is energy lost to noise. The cost is not what you fail to gain. The cost is what you actively spend maintaining disorder. And that cost, compounded over time, is the difference between a life that moves forward and a life that circles endlessly without progress. The system does not delay the consequences of misalignment. It delivers them continuously. But most do not recognize the delivery because they do not connect cause to effect. They see the exhaustion but not the incoherence. They see the stagnation but not the contradiction. And they continue transmitting the same signal, expecting a different result. But the result cannot differ until the signal does. And the signal cannot differ until the interference is eliminated. Misalignment compounds until correction occurs. Most people believe they are in control. They believe that if they work harder, think more carefully, or plan more thoroughly, they can force outcomes to align with their intentions. But control is not what they think it is. Control is not the ability to make things happen. Control is the ability to maintain coherence long enough for things to happen naturally. Tesla did not control electricity. He understood the conditions under which electricity would behave predictably. And once those conditions were established, the outcome was not controlled. It was inevitable. Most people confuse force with control. They apply effort and call it influence. They push against resistance and call it progress. But force is not control. Force is evidence that alignment is absent. When alignment is present, force is unnecessary. The system responds to signal, not to pressure. And signal is not something you impose. It is something you transmit. And what you transmit is determined not by what you say or what you intend, but by what you hold most consistently in the structure of your thinking. The belief in control is itself a form of interference. It assumes that outcomes are produced through willpower, that reality bends to those who push hard enough, that persistence overrides natural law. But natural law does not bend. It operates with or without your consent. And when you act in opposition to it, the law does not pause. It continues. And it produces the result that corresponds to your actual frequency, not to your stated intention. Tesla understood this. He did not try to override the laws of physics. He worked within them. He observed how systems behaved when left to their natural tendencies. And he arranged conditions so that those tendencies produced the outcome he wanted. He did not force the outcome. He made the outcome inevitable, and inevitability does not require control. It requires alignment. Once alignment is achieved, the system does what it must, not because you commanded it, but because no other result is possible. Most people spend their lives trying to manage outcomes. They adjust tactics. They refine strategies. They optimize processes, but they never address the signal, and the signal is the only variable that matters. You can adjust every external factor and still produce the same result if the internal frequency remains unchanged, because the external is always a reflection of the internal, not a delayed reflection, an immediate one. But the reflection is not always obvious. It does not appear in the form you expect. It appears in the form that matches the frequency you are transmitting. If your frequency is scattered, the reflection is scattered. If your frequency is coherent, the reflection is coherent. And coherence does not require management. It requires maintenance. Maintenance is not the same as control. Maintenance is the act of observing where drift occurs and correcting it before it compounds. Tesla maintained his systems. He did not wait for failure to reveal itself. He detected misalignment while it was still a deviation in measurement, not yet a collapse in function, and he corrected it immediately, not with force, with precision. The false belief in control produces a specific kind of exhaustion. It is the exhaustion of trying to hold reality in place through constant intervention, of believing that if you stop managing, everything will fall apart. But this belief is backwards. Things fall apart not because you stop managing them, but because they were never aligned in the first place. A system that requires constant intervention to remain stable is not stable. It is held together by force, and force is not sustainable. Eventually, the force diminishes, and when it does, the system collapses into whatever state the underlying frequency supports. If the underlying frequency is incoherent, the collapse is total. If the underlying frequency is coherent, no collapse occurs, because coherence does not depend on effort, it depends on alignment, and alignment, once established, sustains itself. Tesla did not sustain his systems through effort. He sustained them through design. He built alignment into the structure, and once the structure was aligned, the system required no further input. It functioned exactly as designed, not because he controlled it, but because he had removed every condition that would cause it to fail. Control is an illusion born from the inability to see frequency. When you cannot see frequency, you assume that outcomes are determined by action. So you act more, you intervene more, you adjust more, and the more you act, the more convinced you become that your action is what produces the result. But action does not produce results. Frequency produces results. Action is simply the visible expression of frequency. If the frequency is aligned, the action is effective. If the frequency is misaligned, the action is wasted. This is why two people can perform the same action and produce entirely different results. The action is identical, the frequency is not, and the system responds to frequency, not to action. Tesla did not admire effort. He admired precision. He admired the elimination of waste, and waste, in his view, was any action taken from a misaligned state, because misaligned action does not move the system closer to the desired outcome. It moves the system closer to whatever outcome the misaligned frequency supports, and that outcome is almost never the one you claim to want. How much of your effort is spent compensating for misalignment? This is not a rhetorical question. It is a measurement. If you are constantly adjusting, constantly intervening, constantly managing, you are not in control. You are in reaction, and reaction is not control. Reaction is proof that the underlying frequency is unstable. A stable frequency does not require constant correction. It produces predictable results without intervention. Tesla observed this in every system he designed. When the design was correct, the system performed without supervision. When the design was incorrect, no amount of supervision could make it perform. The problem was never attention. The problem was alignment, and alignment could not be achieved through vigilance. It could only be achieved through correction, at the level of structure. Most people never reach this level. They remain at the level of symptom. They manage the outcome without addressing the cause, and the cause continues to operate, producing the same result, cycle after cycle, until the misalignment is finally acknowledged and corrected. The belief in control causes people to act when they should observe, to force when they should adjust, to intervene when they should allow, because control assumes that the system is passive, that it will not respond unless compelled. But systems are not passive, they are responsive, and they respond not to force but to frequency. When the frequency is correct, the system organizes without prompting. When the frequency is incorrect, no amount of prompting will produce organization. Tesla did not prompt his systems. He tuned them, and once tuned they performed automatically, not because they were controlled, but because they were aligned. And alignment is not something you maintain through willpower. It is something you maintain through observation. by watching where the signal drifts, by noticing where the frequency shifts, and by correcting the shift immediately, not later, not after the result appears, but in the moment the drift is detected, because drift does not remain small, it compounds, and compounded drift is what most people call failure. Most people do not fail because they lack control. They fail because they believe they have control. And that belief prevents them from seeing the actual mechanism. The actual mechanism is frequency. And frequency is not controlled, it is tuned. Tuning requires honesty. Not emotional honesty, but structural honesty. You must be willing to see where your signal is unclear, where your transmission contains contradiction, where your frequency opposes the outcome you claim to want. And you must be willing to correct it, not by forcing yourself to think differently, but by removing the thoughts that produce interference. This is not difficult, but it is precise, and precision requires that you stop managing the outcome and start observing the signal, because the outcome is always a reflection of the signal. And if you want a different outcome, you must first transmit a different signal. And you cannot transmit a different signal while maintaining the belief that you can control the outcome through force. Tesla did not force outcomes. He created conditions, and once the conditions were correct, the outcome appeared without effort. This is the distinction most people never make. They believe that effort produces results, but effort does not produce results. Alignment produces results. Effort is simply the energy you apply, and if that energy is applied in a misaligned state, it does not accumulate into anything useful. It dissipates, it becomes heat, and heat is not progress, heat is waste. Tesla eliminated waste by eliminating misalignment. He did not spend energy forcing systems to behave in ways that contradicted their natural tendencies. He arranged systems so that their natural tendencies produced the desired result. And once arranged, the system required no further input. It functioned, not because he controlled it, but because he had aligned it with the governing law. And the law, once satisfied, enforces itself. The need for control is always evidence of misalignment. When alignment is present, control is irrelevant. The system produces the result automatically, not because you are managing it, but because the conditions make no other result possible. This is what most people never understand. They believe that outcomes are fragile, that without constant attention everything will collapse. But outcomes are not fragile when they emerge from aligned conditions. They are inevitable. And inevitability does not require supervision. It requires only that the conditions remain stable. Tesla did not supervise his inventions once they were complete. He built them correctly from the beginning, and because they were built correctly, they performed correctly. Not sometimes, always, because the design left no room for error. And when there is no room for error, there is no need for control. There is only observation. And observation reveals not what you hope is true, but what is actually true. And what is actually true is that frequency determines outcome, always, without exception, and no amount of control can override that law. The false belief in control creates a life of constant effort with minimal return, because the effort is applied at the wrong level. It is applied at the level of outcome, not at the level of signal. And the outcome cannot change until the signal changes. The signal is not what you say. The signal is not what you intend. The signal is what you transmit through the structure of your thinking, the pattern of your attention, and the frequency you hold most consistently. And that frequency is almost never conscious. It is automatic. It is the default state. And the default state is where misalignment lives. Tesla did not operate from default. He operated from design. He designed his thinking the way he designed his machines, with precision, with attention to every variable, with the understanding that small deviations compound into total failure. And he did not wait for failure to appear before correcting the deviation. He corrected it the moment it was detected, because he understood that correction is not a response to failure. Correction is the prevention of failure, and prevention requires not control but awareness. Control is the illusion you cling to when you cannot see the mechanism. Once the mechanism is visible, control is no longer necessary, because the mechanism operates whether you control it or not. The only question is whether the mechanism is aligned with the outcome you want. If it is aligned, the outcome appears. If it is not aligned, no amount of control will produce it. And the mechanism is always frequency. Frequency is not something you control. It is something you are, or more precisely, it is something you transmit. And what you transmit is determined by what you hold. Not by what you claim to hold, but by what you actually hold. In the quiet moments, in the automatic thoughts, in the reactions you do not choose. That is your frequency, and that frequency is what the system responds to, not to your intentions, not to your plans, but to what you are actually transmitting. And if what you are transmitting is incoherent, the response will be incoherent, not because you failed to control it, but because the signal was never aligned. You do not control outcomes. You align with the conditions that make outcomes inevitable. And once those conditions are present, the outcome does not require force. It does not require management. It does not require constant intervention. It simply appears, because the law demands it, and the law does not negotiate. Tesla understood this completely. He did not negotiate with reality. He did not try to convince electricity to behave differently. He observed how it behaved. He identified the conditions under which it behaved predictably, and he created those conditions. And once created, the result was not in doubt. It was guaranteed, not by control but by alignment. And alignment is the only form of power that does not deplete over time. Alignment makes control irrelevant. Tesla did not begin with theory. He began with observation. He watched systems that functioned without human intervention. He watched water flow downhill. He watched current move through a conductor. He watched energy organize itself into patterns that repeated without variation. And he recognized that these patterns were not accidents. They were expressions of law. Law is not what someone decided should happen. Law is what must happen when certain conditions are met. And the conditions are not negotiable. Water does not flow uphill because you want it to. Current does not reverse direction because you command it. Energy does not organize into disorder because you hope for complexity. The system responds to structure, and structure is determined by frequency. Tesla observed this in nature long before he applied it to invention. He saw that natural systems do not struggle. They do not force outcomes. They simply respond to the conditions that govern them. And when those conditions are aligned with natural law, the result is automatic. Natural order is not imposed from outside. It emerges from within. A crystal does not form because someone arranged its atoms. It forms because the atomic structure has a natural tendency towards symmetry. And when the conditions allow, that symmetry expresses itself without effort. Tesla understood that the same principle applies to every system, not just physical systems but mental ones, conceptual ones, relational ones. Every system has a natural frequency, and when that frequency is allowed to operate without interference, the system organizes into its most stable state. The most stable state is not the most complex, it is the most coherent. Coherence is not variety. Coherence is alignment, and alignment does not require constant adjustment. It requires only that interference be removed. Once interference is removed, the system does what it was always going to do, not because you made it happen, but because the conditions left no other possibility. Most people do not observe natural order. They observe artificial order. They observe what has been constructed, managed, and maintained through effort, and they assume that effort is the mechanism. But effort is not the mechanism. Effort is the compensation for misalignment. When alignment is present, effort decreases. When alignment is absent, effort increases. And no amount of increased effort will produce alignment, because effort and alignment are not related. Effort is energy applied. Alignment is structure corrected. And you cannot correct structure by applying more energy to a misaligned system. You can only correct structure by removing the conditions that cause misalignment. Tesla did not add energy to failing systems. He removed interference. And the moment interference was removed, the system stabilized. Not because he forced it to stabilize, but because stability was its natural state. And natural states do not require maintenance once the conditions that produce instability are eliminated. Tesla observed that energy is never lost, it only changes form. When energy is applied to an aligned system, it becomes work. When energy is applied to a misaligned system, it becomes heat. Heat is not useful, heat is waste, and waste is the signature of misalignment. Most people generate enormous amounts of waste. They think constantly, they plan endlessly, they act repeatedly, but the energy does not translate into movement. It translates into exhaustion, because the system they are operating within is not aligned, and an unaligned system cannot convert energy into work. It can only convert energy into friction. Friction is what you feel when you are working against yourself, when your thoughts oppose your actions, when your beliefs contradict your intentions, when your attention is divided between what you want and what you fear. And the system which processes all of this as signal responds by producing heat, not light, not movement, just heat. And heat depletes you without moving you forward. Natural order does not require belief. It operates whether you understand it or not, whether you accept it or not, whether you align with it or not. The law continues, and the law produces results that correspond to the conditions present. If the conditions are aligned with natural order, the result is flow. If the conditions oppose natural order, the result is resistance. And resistance does not diminish because you ignore it. It increases, because every action taken in opposition to natural law compounds the misalignment. Tesla did not oppose natural law. He studied it. He observed how systems behaved when left alone, how energy moved when unobstructed, how structures stabilized when interference was absent, and he designed his systems to mirror those conditions. He did not invent new laws. He applied existing ones, and because the laws were universal, the results were predictable. Not sometimes predictable, always predictable. Because law does not vary, it does not make exceptions, it simply operates. What would happen if you stopped forcing and started observing? This is not a philosophical question. It is a diagnostic one. Most people never stop long enough to observe. They react, they adjust, they intervene, and the constant intervention prevents them from seeing what the system would do on its own. But the system has tendencies, it has natural inclinations, and those inclinations reveal the underlying frequency. If you observe where your attention goes when you are not directing it, you will see your actual frequency, not the frequency you claim, not the frequency you wish you had, but the frequency you are actually transmitting, and that frequency is what the system responds to. Tesla observed his own tendencies. He watched where his thinking drifted. He noticed what captured his attention without effort, and he recognized that those patterns were not random, they were structural, and if the structure was misaligned, no amount of conscious effort would override it. The structure had to be corrected, and correction began with observation. Natural order is not chaotic, it is precise. A seed does not become a tree through randomness. It becomes a tree through a sequence that is encoded in its structure, and that sequence unfolds automatically when the conditions are correct. Soil, water, light, temperature. These are not suggestions, they are requirements. And when the requirements are met, the outcome is not uncertain, it is guaranteed. Tesla applied this same logic to every system he designed. He identified the requirements, he established the conditions, and he removed everything that would interfere with the natural unfolding of the process. He did not rush the process. He did not force the process. He allowed the process to complete according to its own timing, and the timing was always correct. Not because he controlled it, but because he had aligned the conditions with the governing law, and the law enforces its own timing. Most people work against natural order without realizing it. They set goals that contradict their actual frequency. They declare intentions that oppose their habitual thinking. They take actions that conflict with their underlying beliefs. and then they wonder why the system does not respond. But the system is responding. It is responding to the actual frequency, not to the declared intention. And the actual frequency is almost always incoherent, not because people are dishonest, but because they are unaware. They do not observe the contradiction. They do not see the interference. And they do not recognize that the system is producing exactly what their frequency demands, not what their words demand, what their frequency demands. Tesla observed the contradiction immediately. He did not tolerate it. He did not justify it. He corrected it, because he understood that contradiction is not a personality trait. It is a structural flaw. And structural flaws do not resolve through time. They resolve through correction. Natural order operates on principles that do not change. Gravity does not pause because you are tired. Entropy does not reverse because you are hopeful. Energy does not organize into complexity without structure. These are constants, and constants are reliable. Tesla relied on constants. He did not build systems that required favorable conditions. He built systems that functioned regardless of conditions, because he aligned them with principles that operated universally. Not principles he invented, principles he observed. An observation is the foundation of all alignment. You cannot align with what you do not see. And most people do not see the governing principles because they are focused on outcomes. They watch the result and miss the cause. But the cause is always frequency, and frequency is always present. It is operating in every moment, and it is producing results in every moment. Not delayed results, immediate results. But the results are not always visible. They accumulate, and once accumulated they become undeniable. But by then the frequency has been repeated so many times that it feels like identity. And identity is the hardest structure to correct. Tesla did not identify with his outcomes. He identified with his method. His method was observation, alignment, and elimination of interference. And that method produced results consistently because the method was aligned with natural law. Natural law does not care about effort. It does not care about intention. It does not care about emotion. It responds to structure. And structure is either aligned or it is not. There is no middle ground. A system is either coherent or incoherent. A signal is either clear or fragmented. A frequency is either stable or unstable. And the system responds accordingly, not with judgment, not with bias, but with mechanical precision. Tesla trusted that precision. He did not hope his designs would work. He knew they would work, because he had eliminated every variable that could cause failure. And once those variables were eliminated, failure was not possible. Not because he was lucky, because the conditions made success inevitable. And inevitability is not something you create. It is something you reveal by removing everything that obscures it. Natural order is not something you achieve. It is something you allow. And you allow it by removing interference. Interference is not always external. Most interference is internal. It is the thought that contradicts the goal, the belief that opposes the intention, the habit that undermines the action. And this interference does not disappear because you ignore it. It remains, and it operates, and it produces results that reflect its presence. Tesla did not ignore interference. He identified it, he measured it, and he eliminated it, not through force but through precision. He did not try to overpower the interference. He removed the conditions that allowed it to exist. And once those conditions were removed, the interference dissolved, not gradually, immediately, because interference is not a thing, it is a relationship. And when the relationship is broken, the interference ceases to exist. And what remains is order, not imposed order, natural order, the order that was always present beneath the noise. Tesla understood that systems are not broken, they are misaligned. And misalignment is not permanent, it is conditional. Change the conditions and the alignment changes. Change the alignment and the result changes. Not someday, not eventually, but in the moment the alignment is corrected, Because the system does not wait. It responds immediately to the frequency it receives, and the frequency it receives is the frequency you transmit, not the frequency you wish you were transmitting, not the frequency you claim you are transmitting, but the frequency that is actually present. And that frequency is determined not by your words, but by your structure, the structure of your thinking, the structure of your attention, the structure of your automatic responses. And that structure is either aligned with natural order or it is not. And if it is not, no amount of effort will produce the result you want, because the result is always determined by structure, and structure is always determined by frequency. When you stop working against natural law and start working within it, everything simplifies. Not because the task becomes easier, but because resistance disappears. And without resistance, energy is no longer converted into heat. It is converted into work. And work produces visible results, not because you forced them, but because the conditions made them inevitable. Tesla lived in that inevitability. He did not hope. He did not wish. He observed, aligned, and allowed. And what he allowed was not chaos. It was order. The order that exists beneath every system when interference is absent. That order is not something you create. It is something you reveal. And you reveal it by removing everything that hides it. Natural order emerges when interference is removed. Frequency is not a metaphor. It is the rate at which a system oscillates. Every system has a frequency. A pendulum swings at a specific rate. A circuit alternates at a measurable interval. A thought repeats at a consistent rhythm. And when two systems share the same frequency, they resonate. Resonance is not mystical. It is mechanical. When one tuning fork is struck, another tuning fork of the same frequency begins to vibrate without being touched. The energy transfers through the medium, not because the second fork decided to vibrate, but because the frequency matched. And when frequency matches, energy amplifies. Tesla observed this in every domain. He observed it in electrical systems. He observed it in mechanical structures. And he observed it in human behavior. The principle does not change. Resonance occurs when frequency aligns. And when resonance occurs, small inputs produce large outputs. Not because the input was strong, but because the system was tuned to amplify it. Most people do not understand that they are always transmitting a frequency. They believe that thoughts are private, that internal states are invisible. But frequency is not contained. It radiates. And it affects every system it encounters. When your frequency is coherent, the systems around you respond by organizing. When your frequency is incoherent, the systems around you respond by destabilizing. This is not influence. This is resonance. You are not persuading the system. You are tuning it. And the system tunes to whatever frequency is strongest and most consistent. If your frequency is scattered, the system scatters. If your frequency is stable, the system stabilizes. And stability is not something you impose. It is something that emerges when the conditions support it. Tesla did not impose stability on his systems. He created the conditions under which stability was the only possible outcome. And those conditions were always rooted in frequency alignment. Frequency is the organizing principle. It determines how energy moves, how structures form, and how outcomes appear. When frequency is aligned with the natural tendency of a system, the system amplifies. When frequency opposes the natural tendency, the system resists. And resistance is not a moral judgment, it is a mechanical response. The system is not refusing to cooperate. The system is responding to the signal it receives. And if the signal is misaligned, the response is misalignment. Tesla understood that you cannot change the response without changing the signal, and you cannot change the signal without changing the frequency. And frequency is not something you declare. Frequency is something you hold, and what you hold is revealed not by what you say, but by what you repeat, not in speech, but in thought, not in intention, but in attention. And attention, when sustained, becomes frequency, and frequency, when sustained, becomes structure, and structure determines outcome, always. Most people try to change outcomes without changing frequency. They adjust their behavior, They refine their tactics, they modify their language, but the underlying frequency remains unchanged, and the system which responds to frequency continues to produce the same result. This is why change feels so difficult for most people. They are working at the wrong level. They are working at the level of action when the problem exists at the level of transmission, and transmission is not something you control through willpower. Transmission is automatic. It is the natural expression of whatever frequency is dominant in your system. If the dominant frequency is fear, the transmission is fear. If the dominant frequency is doubt, the transmission is doubt. And the system responds to what is transmitted, not to what is intended. Tesla did not rely on intention. He relied on measurement. He measured the frequency, he adjusted the variables, and he observed the response. And when the response did not match the desired outcome, he did not question the system. He questioned the frequency, because the system was always correct. It was responding exactly as it must. The question was whether the frequency was aligned with the desired result. Frequency is cumulative. A single thought held for 3 seconds does not produce a measurable result. But a thought repeated 10,000 times creates a pattern, and a pattern once established operates automatically. It becomes the default state, and the default state is what the system amplifies. Not the state you consciously choose, but the state you unconsciously maintain. Tesla understood that default states are where misalignment lives, because default states are formed through repetition, not through decision. And most people never examine what they repeat. They repeat thoughts that were never consciously chosen. They repeat beliefs that were inherited, not evaluated. They repeat patterns that were formed in response to conditions that no longer exist. And those patterns continue to operate, and they continue to produce results. And the results continue to reflect the frequency that formed them. Not the frequency you wish you had, the frequency you actually have. When frequency is aligned with natural law, the system does not resist, it responds. And the response is proportional to the clarity of the signal. A weak signal that is perfectly aligned will outperform a strong signal that is scattered. This is why some people achieve results that seem effortless, while others labor without progress. The difference is not effort. The difference is not talent. The difference is resonance. And resonance is not something you force. It is something you tune. Tuning requires that you know what frequency you are transmitting. And most people do not know. They assume they are transmitting what they intend to transmit. But intention is not transmission. Intention is a statement. Transmission is a signal. And the signal is determined not by what you say, but by what you hold. And what you hold is almost always unconscious. It is the background frequency, the hum beneath the noise, and that hum is what the system responds to. How much of your attention is spent on what you do not want? This is not a question of morality, it is a question of frequency. Every moment of attention spent on fear is a transmission of fear. Every moment spent on doubt is a transmission of doubt. And the system does not distinguish between attention spent affirming what you want and attention spent resisting what you fear. It responds to the frequency of the attention itself. If the attention is focused on disorder, the frequency is disorder. And the system which amplifies frequency produces more disorder. Not because you wanted disorder, but because disorder was the dominant signal. Tesla understood this completely. He did not allow his attention to drift toward failure. He did not rehearse catastrophe. He did not entertain doubt. Not because he was optimistic, but because he understood that attention is transmission, and transmission is frequency, and frequency is law, and law does not negotiate. Frequency is not static, it shifts, and it shifts in response to what you feed it. If you feed it contradiction, it becomes incoherent. If you feed it alignment, it becomes stable. And stability, once achieved, does not require constant reinforcement. It requires only that the conditions that produce instability be kept absent. Tesla did not maintain stability through effort. He maintained it through design. He designed his system so that instability was not possible. He eliminated the variables that would cause drift. And once those variables were eliminated, the system remained stable without intervention. Most people do the opposite. They allow instability to exist and then try to compensate for it through effort. But effort does not eliminate instability, it masks it. And the moment effort decreases, instability reappears, because the underlying frequency was never corrected. It was only suppressed. And suppression is not correction. Suppression is delay, and delay always ends. Frequency determines what you attract, not in a mystical sense, but in a mechanical one. When you transmit a specific frequency, systems that operate at that frequency respond. Systems that operate at different frequencies do not. This is not choice. This is resonance. A radio tuned to one station does not receive signals from another station. Not because the other signals are absent, but because the receiver is not tuned to them. Your mind operates the same way. It receives what it is tuned to, and it is tuned to whatever frequency is dominant in your internal state. If the dominant frequency is lack, you perceive lack. If the dominant frequency is sufficiency, you perceive sufficiency. The external conditions do not change. The perception changes. And perception is not passive. Perception organizes behavior. Behavior produces outcomes. And outcomes reinforce perception. This is the loop. And the loop is governed by frequency. Change the frequency and the loop changes. Not gradually, immediately, because the system does not wait for permission. It responds the moment the signal shifts. Tesla did not wait for resonance to appear. He created it. He tuned his systems to the frequency he wanted to amplify. And once tuned, the amplification was automatic. He did not need to sustain it through effort. He needed only to maintain the tuning. And maintenance is not the same as effort. Maintenance is observation. It is the act of noticing when the frequency begins to drift and correcting it before the drift becomes structural. Most people never maintain. They drift, and they drift until the distance between their current frequency and their desired outcome is so large that correction feels impossible. But correction is never impossible. It is simply more costly the longer it is delayed. A small drift corrected immediately requires minimal adjustment. The same drift allowed to compound requires complete reconstruction. Tesla corrected drift immediately, not because he feared failure, but because he understood that drift is not benign. Drift is directional, and if the direction is away from alignment, the outcome is predictable, and the outcome is always misalignment compounded over time. Frequency is not something you achieve once. It is something you transmit continuously, and what you transmit continuously is what you become, not metaphorically, structurally. The frequency you hold most consistently becomes the structure of your system, and the structure of your system determines what is possible within it. If the structure is incoherent, coherent outcomes are not possible. If the structure is aligned, aligned outcomes are inevitable. Tesla understood that possibility is not infinite. Possibility is constrained by structure, and structure is constrained by frequency, and frequency is constrained by nothing except what you allow. You allow interference or you do not. You allow contradiction or you do not. You allow drift or you do not. And what you allow determines what you transmit. And what you transmit determines what the system produces. Not someday, not eventually, but continuously, in every moment. The system is always responding, and it is always responding to the frequency you are transmitting right now, not the frequency you transmitted yesterday. Not the frequency you plan to transmit tomorrow, but the one that is present in this moment. And if that frequency is misaligned, the response is misalignment. Not because you failed, because the law requires it. Resonance does not require belief. It requires alignment. And alignment is not emotional. It is structural. It is the condition where all variables point in the same direction. Where thought, attention, belief, and action are not in conflict, where the signal is clear because the transmission is unified. Tesla achieved this not through inspiration, but through elimination. He eliminated every thought that opposed his goal. He eliminated every habit that contradicted his intention. He eliminated every pattern that introduced noise, and what remained was signal, pure signal, and pure signal produces pure response, not because the universe rewards purity, but because purity is coherence, and coherence is the only condition under which resonance can occur. When resonance occurs, outcomes are no longer forced, they are summoned, not through magic, but through law. The law of frequency, the law that governs how energy moves, how systems stabilize, and how reality responds. And that law does not bend. It operates with or without your understanding, with or without your consent, and it produces results that correspond exactly to the frequency you transmit, always, without exception, without delay. Frequency is the organizing principle, because frequency is what the system detects, not intention, not effort, not hope, frequency. And frequency is either aligned or it is not. And if it is not, no amount of action will compensate, because action is downstream from frequency. Action is the visible expression of whatever frequency is dominant. And if the dominant frequency is incoherent, the action will be incoherent. And incoherent action produces incoherent results, not because the action was wrong, but because the frequency that produced it was misaligned. Tesla did not focus on action, he focused on frequency. And once frequency was correct, action became automatic. And automatic action is always more effective than forced action, because automatic action is the natural expression of an aligned system. And an aligned system does not struggle, it flows. And flow is not something you create. Flow is what remains when resistance is eliminated. And resistance is eliminated when frequency is aligned. Frequency determines what the system amplifies. Force is the language of misalignment. When a system is aligned, force is unnecessary. The outcome appears not because it was compelled, but because the conditions made it inevitable. Tesla observed this repeatedly. When his designs failed, the failure was never due to insufficient effort. The failure was due to structural opposition, two components vibrating at conflicting frequencies, a material that could not conduct the required current, a configuration that introduced resistance where flow was needed, and no amount of force applied to a misaligned system would make it function. The system would simply absorb the force and convert it to heat. Heat is not progress, heat is waste, and waste is the signature of misalignment. Tesla did not increase force when his systems failed. He corrected the alignment, and the moment alignment was achieved, the system performed without requiring additional input, not because the system became stronger, but because opposition was eliminated. And without opposition, even minimal energy produces maximum result. Most people believe that if something is not working, more force is the answer. More effort, more hours, more intensity. But force does not correct misalignment. Force compounds it. When you push against a system that is structurally opposed to the outcome you want, you do not move the system closer to that outcome. You increase the stress within the system. And stress, when sustained, leads to collapse. Not gradual decline, but sudden failure. Because the system was never designed to sustain that level of opposition. Tesla understood this. He did not push systems beyond their natural capacity. He designed systems so that their natural capacity was sufficient. And sufficiency is not about strength. Sufficiency is about alignment. A system aligned with natural law does not require exceptional strength. It requires only that the components do not oppose each other. And when components do not oppose each other, the system functions at its natural efficiency. And natural efficiency is always higher than forced efficiency. Forcing order is not the same as creating order. Forcing order means imposing a structure that the system resists. Creating order means removing the conditions that prevent the system from organizing naturally. Natural organization is not chaotic, it is precise. A crystal forms into exact geometric patterns not because someone arranged each molecule, but because the molecular structure has a natural tendency towards symmetry. And when interference is absent, that symmetry expresses itself automatically. Tesla applied this principle to every system he designed. He did not force symmetry, he removed asymmetry. And once asymmetry was removed, symmetry appeared, not as something added, but as something revealed. Because symmetry was always the natural state, it was simply hidden beneath the interference. And interference is not a permanent condition, it is a temporary obstruction. Remove the obstruction, and the natural state returns immediately, not gradually, immediately. Because the system does not need to learn how to be aligned, it only needs the space to express its alignment. Most people spend their lives forcing outcomes that could organize naturally if the interference were removed. They force relationships that are structurally incompatible. They force goals that contradict their actual frequency. They force behaviors that oppose their underlying beliefs. And the force required increases over time, because the misalignment does not decrease through repetition. It deepens. Every forced action reinforces the pattern of force. And eventually, force becomes the only way the system knows how to operate. At that point, the idea of allowing something to happen naturally feels impossible. It feels passive. It feels like surrender. But allowing is not passive. Allowing is the removal of opposition, and opposition is what makes force necessary. Tesla did not surrender outcomes. He surrendered opposition. And the moment opposition was surrendered, outcomes appeared without force. Not because he stopped caring, but because he stopped interfering. And interference is what most people call effort. Why does the same action require different amounts of effort at different times? This is not a question of circumstances. It is a question of alignment. When the action is aligned with your internal frequency, it feels effortless. When the action opposes your internal frequency, it feels exhausting. The action is identical. The effort is not. And the difference is not in the action. The difference is in the resistance the action must overcome. When internal resistance is high, even simple actions require enormous effort. When internal resistance is low, complex actions feel natural. Tesla observed this in himself. He noticed when work felt heavy, and when it felt heavy, he did not work harder. He stopped. He observed where the resistance was coming from, and he corrected it. Not by forcing himself to feel differently, but by identifying the thought or belief that opposed the action. And once identified, the thought could be examined. And once examined, it could be released. Not suppressed. Released, because suppression does not eliminate resistance. It buries it. And buried resistance always resurfaces. Forcing order creates dependency. When a system only functions because you are forcing it, the system is not functional. It is held together by your effort. And the moment your effort decreases, the system collapses. This is why most people cannot rest. They believe that if they stop forcing, everything will fall apart. And they are correct. But not because order requires force, because the order they have created is artificial. It is imposed, not inherent. And imposed order does not sustain itself. Natural order sustains itself, because natural order is not maintained through force. It is maintained through alignment, and alignment does not deplete over time. It stabilizes over time. Tesla built systems that did not require his presence to function. Once the design was complete, the system operated according to its own principles. He did not need to supervise it. He did not need to adjust it. He needed only to ensure that the initial alignment was correct. And if the initial alignment was correct, the system remained correct. Not because he controlled it, but because he had removed every condition that would cause it to deviate. Force is always evidence of opposition. When you are forcing, you are working against something. Sometimes the opposition is external, but most often the opposition is internal. It is the thought that contradicts the action, the belief that opposes the goal, the habit that undermines the intention. And internal opposition is far more costly than external opposition. Because internal opposition is constant, it operates every moment, and every moment it operates, it consumes energy. Not energy that produces movement, but energy that produces heat. And heat, as Tesla understood, is waste. Waste is not neutral. Waste is destructive. It depletes the system without producing any result that moves the system closer to its goal. And a system that is constantly depleting itself will eventually fail, not because the goal was wrong, but because the system was never aligned to achieve it, and no amount of force will compensate for misalignment, because force is not alignment. Force is compensation, and compensation is temporary. Alignment is permanent. Tesla did not admire force. He admired elegance, and elegance is not complexity. Elegance is simplicity that achieves maximum result with minimum input. A perfectly tuned system is elegant. It does not require constant adjustment. It does not require supervision. It functions exactly as designed, because every element is aligned with every other element. And when all elements are aligned, there is no internal opposition. And without internal opposition, the system operates at maximum efficiency. Maximum efficiency is not about working harder. Maximum efficiency is about eliminating waste. And waste exists wherever force is required. Force is required wherever misalignment exists. And misalignment exists wherever frequency is incoherent. This is the chain. And the chain always leads back to frequency, not to effort, not to intention, but to frequency. And frequency is either aligned, or it is not. And if it is not, no amount of force will make the system function as if it were. Most people use force because they do not know how to correct alignment. They feel the resistance. They recognize that something is not working, but they do not trace the resistance to its source. They do not ask why the resistance exists. They simply apply more force. And the more force they apply, the more convinced they become that force is the solution. But force is not the solution. Force is the symptom. It is proof that alignment is absent. And alignment is not restored through force. Alignment is restored through observation, by watching where the system resists, by identifying what is causing the resistance, and by removing it, not by overpowering it, but by eliminating the conditions that allow it to exist. Tesla eliminated resistance at the source. He did not build stronger systems to overcome resistance. He built systems where resistance could not form. And once resistance could not form, the system functioned without effort. Not because the system was powerful, but because the system was aligned. And aligned systems do not require power. They require only coherence. Forcing order exhausts the one who forces, because force is not sustainable. You can force for a day. You can force for a week, you can force for a year, but eventually the capacity to force diminishes, and when it diminishes, the system collapses into whatever state the underlying frequency supports. If the underlying frequency is aligned, no collapse occurs. If the underlying frequency is maligned, total collapse is inevitable. Tesla did not rely on his capacity to force. He relied on his capacity to align. And alignment is not a resource that depletes. Alignment is a condition that stabilizes. Once established, it does not require constant renewal. It requires only that the conditions that produce misalignment be kept absent. And those conditions are always internal. They are thoughts that oppose goals, beliefs that contradict intentions, patterns that reinforce what you claim to reject. And these conditions are not fixed. They are chosen. Not consciously, but structurally, and they can be unchosen the moment they are seen. Force creates resistance. This is a law. When you push against a system, the system pushes back, not out of malice, but out of mechanics. Every action has an equal and opposite reaction, and the harder you push, the harder the system resists. Tesla did not push, he tuned, and tuning does not create resistance. Tuning eliminates it by adjusting frequency until the system resonates. And when the system resonates, it does not resist. It amplifies. Small inputs produce large outputs, not because the inputs are strong, but because the system is aligned to receive them. And alignment is not something you force. Alignment is something you allow by removing the interference that prevents it. Interference is not external. Interference is internal. It is every contradiction you maintain, every belief that opposes your goal, every habit that undermines your stated direction. And interference does not resolve through force, it resolves through recognition. And recognition requires that you stop forcing long enough to observe what you are actually transmitting, not what you claim to transmit, what you actually transmit. And what you actually transmit is always revealed by the results you consistently produce. When you stop forcing and start aligning, the system does not collapse, it stabilizes, not because you are holding it together, but because the conditions that cause instability have been removed. And without those conditions, instability cannot exist. Stability is the natural state of an aligned system. It is not something you create. It is something you reveal. By removing the interference, by eliminating the contradiction, by correcting the frequency. And once corrected, the frequency sustains itself. Because aligned frequencies do not drift randomly. They remain stable until something disrupts them. And if you do not introduce disruption, none occurs. Tesla maintained stability by refusing to introduce disruption. He did not entertain thoughts that opposed his goals. He did not engage in behaviors that contradicted his intentions. He did not allow his attention to drift toward disorder. And because he did not allow disruption, disruption did not occur, and the system remained aligned. And alignment, once maintained, produces results that do not require force. They require only that the frequency remains stable, and the frequency remains stable when opposition is absent. Force is what you apply when you do not trust alignment. When you believe that without constant pressure, the outcome will not appear. But this belief is itself a frequency, and that frequency is doubt. And doubt is interference. And interference prevents the very alignment that would make force unnecessary. Tesla did not doubt, not because he was confident, but because he had removed the conditions that produced doubt. He observed, he measured, he corrected, and once corrected, the outcome was not in question. It was inevitable, and inevitability does not require force. It requires only that the conditions remain stable. And conditions remain stable when frequency remains coherent. And frequency remains coherent when contradiction is absent. This is the sequence, and the sequence does not change, not for anyone, not under any circumstance. It is law, and law does not negotiate. Alignment eliminates the need for force. Alignment is not a single act, it is a sequence, and the sequence matters. Most people try to align outcomes before aligning frequency. They want the result to appear first, and then they will believe the principle. But the system does not operate in reverse. The system responds to what is present, not to what is promised. And what is present is frequency, not future frequency, not intended frequency, but the frequency that exists in this moment. And if that frequency is misaligned, the system produces misalignment. Not later. Now. Tesla understood that sequence cannot be violated. You cannot harvest before you plant. You cannot tune after the signal has already been transmitted. You cannot correct the outcome without first correcting the cause. And the cause is always frequency. And frequency exists at the level of structure, not at the level of action. And structure must be corrected before action will produce the desired result. This is not opinion, this is mechanics. Most people live in reverse sequence. They act first and align later. They declare goals without correcting the beliefs that oppose those goals. They take steps forward while their attention remains fixed on what they fear. They work toward an outcome while maintaining a frequency that contradicts it. And then they wonder why progress is so slow. But progress is not slow. The system is responding at full speed. It is responding to the actual frequency, not to the stated intention. And the actual frequency is misaligned. So the system produces misalignment at full speed. And the harder they work, the faster the misalignment compounds. Because effort does not correct sequence. Effort amplifies whatever frequency is dominant. If the dominant frequency is coherent, effort produces coherent results. If the dominant frequency is incoherent, effort produces incoherent results. Faster, not slower. Tesla did not apply effort to misaligned systems. He corrected the sequence first. He aligned the frequency before taking action. And once the frequency was aligned, action was not effortful, it was automatic. Because aligned action is the natural expression of aligned structure. Sequence correction begins with observation, not with action. You must see what is actually present before you can correct it. Most people do not observe, they assume. They assume their frequency is aligned because their intention is sincere. But intention is not frequency. Intention is a statement made once. Frequency is a signal transmitted continuously. And the signal is not determined by what you say. It is determined by what you hold. What you hold is revealed by where your attention returns when you are not directing it, by what you think about in the gaps between tasks, by what you rehearse when no one is watching. And what you rehearse is almost always not what you intend. It is what you fear, what you doubt, what you believe is more likely than what you want. And those beliefs are frequency. And that frequency is what the system responds to. Tesla observed his own frequency with the same precision he applied to his machines. He did not assume alignment, he measured it, and when measurement revealed misalignment, he did not justify it. He corrected it, immediately, because he understood that uncorrected misalignment does not remain static, it propagates, and propagation is always directional, and the direction is always away from the desired outcome. The first step in sequence correction is identification. You must identify where the misalignment exists. Not in vague terms, but precisely. Is it a belief? Is it a habit? Is it a pattern of attention? Is it a contradiction between what you say and what you do? Most people cannot answer this question. They feel the misalignment, but they cannot locate it. And what cannot be located cannot be corrected. Tesla located misalignment by observing where resistance appeared. Resistance is not random. It appears at the exact point where two frequencies oppose each other. If you feel resistance, there is opposition, and opposition is always structural. It is not circumstantial. It is not external. It is the result of two signals moving in different directions within the same system, and those signals are both yours. One is conscious, one is unconscious, and the unconscious signal is almost always stronger, because it has been repeated more often. It has been reinforced through years of attention, and attention when repeated becomes structure, and structure determines outcome, always. The second step is elimination. Once the misalignment is identified, it must be eliminated, not managed, not compensated for, eliminated. Tesla did not manage interference. He removed it, and removal is not the same as suppression. Suppression is pushing the interference out of awareness while it continues to operate. Elimination is removing the conditions that allow the interference to exist, and the conditions are always internal. They are thoughts, beliefs, patterns, and they exist because they have been repeated, and they have been repeated because they were never examined. Most people inherit their beliefs. They absorb them from their environment, and they never question whether those beliefs are aligned with the outcomes they want. But beliefs are not neutral. Beliefs are frequencies, and frequencies determine results. If the belief opposes the goal will not be achieved. Not because the goal is impossible, but because the frequency does not support it. And the system always produces results that match frequency, not results that match intention. The third step is stabilization. Once the misalignment is eliminated, the new alignment must be stabilized. Stabilization is not the same as repetition. Repetition without coherence simply reinforces incoherence. Stabilization is the act of maintaining the new frequency long enough for it to become structural, and the time required is not long. It is only as long as it takes for the old pattern to stop asserting itself. And the old pattern stops asserting itself the moment it is no longer fed. Patterns are sustained through attention. When attention is withdrawn, the pattern weakens. And when the pattern weakens, it no longer competes with the new frequency. And when competition ceases, the new frequency stabilizes. Tesla did not struggle to maintain new patterns. He simply refused to feed old ones. And refusal is not effort. Refusal is redirection. It is the act of noticing when attention drifts toward the old pattern and redirecting it toward the new one. Not with force, with precision. And precision, when practiced consistently, becomes automatic. And automatic alignment is the only alignment that lasts. Where does your sequence break? This is not a rhetorical question. It is diagnostic. Most people break sequence at the same point every time. They identify the goal, they declare the intention, and then they act without correcting the underlying frequency. And the action, which is downstream from frequency, reflects the misalignment. And the result reinforces the belief that the goal is difficult. But the goal is not difficult. The sequence is incorrect. And incorrect sequence always produces incorrect results. Not sometimes, always. Because the system does not make exceptions. It does not reward effort that is applied in the wrong order. It simply responds to what is present. And if what is present is misaligned frequency followed by action, the result is misaligned outcome. Guaranteed. Tesla never broke sequence. He observed first. He aligned second. He acted third. And the result was fourth. Never first. Never second. Always fourth. Because the result is not something you create. The result is something the system produces once the conditions are correct. And the conditions are correct only when frequency is aligned before action is taken. Most people reverse this. They want the result first. They want proof before they commit to alignment. But proof does not appear before alignment. Proof appears after alignment. And the delay is not arbitrary. The delay is the time required for the system to respond to the new frequency. And the system responds immediately. But the response is not always visible immediately. The response accumulates. And once accumulated, it becomes undeniable. But accumulation requires that the frequency remains stable. And the frequency remains stable only when the sequence is not broken. If you align for one day and then revert to misalignment, the accumulation resets. The system does not store credit for past alignment. It responds to present frequency, always. Tesla maintained alignment continuously. He did not align when convenient. He aligned because alignment was the only condition under which the outcome was possible. And maintaining that condition was not optional, it was required. Not by morality, by mechanics. Sequence correction is not linear. It is cyclical. You observe, you eliminate, you stabilize, and then you observe again. Because new misalignments appear, not because the system is broken, but because conditions change. And changing conditions require changing alignment. Tesla did not align once and assume the system would remain aligned forever. He monitored, he measured, he adjusted, and he adjusted continuously, not because he was paranoid, but because he understood that alignment is not a destination. Alignment is a state, and states must be maintained. And maintenance is not effort. Maintenance is attention. It is the act of noticing when drift occurs, and correcting it before the drift becomes structural. And drift always occurs, not because you are flawed, but because systems are dynamic. And dynamic systems require dynamic alignment. Static alignment in a dynamic system is guaranteed misalignment, because the system has changed, but the alignment has not. And mismatched alignment is no different from no alignment. Sequence correction does not require perfection. It requires consistency. Perfect alignment held for 1 hour is less effective than approximate alignment held continuously. Because the system responds to what is sustained, not to what is perfect. And what is sustained becomes structure, and structure determines outcome. Tesla was not perfect, but he was consistent. He observed consistently, he corrected consistently, and he maintained consistently. And consistency over time produces results that appear extraordinary. But they are not extraordinary. They are inevitable, because the frequency was held long enough for the system to organize around it. And once the system organizes, the result is not something you create. It is something the system delivers, automatically, not because you deserved it, but because the conditions made it unavoidable. And the conditions are always frequency. And frequency is always the result of sequence. And sequence is always under your control, not control in the sense of force. Control in the sense of choice. You choose what to observe. You choose what to eliminate. You choose what to stabilize. And those choices determine sequence, and sequence determines outcome. Most people do not fail because they lack knowledge. They fail because they apply knowledge in the wrong sequence. They learn the principle, they understand the mechanism, and then they act without aligning their internal state. And the action, which reflects the internal state, produces a result that contradicts the principle they just learned. And they conclude that the principle does not work. But the principle always works. The sequence was wrong, and wrong sequence produces wrong results. Not because the universe is punishing you, but because the system is responding exactly as it must. The system does not interpret effort. It does not reward sincerity. It responds to frequency, and frequency is determined by sequence. And if the sequence places action before alignment, the action will reflect misalignment, always, without exception. Tesla never expected the system to make exceptions. He expected the system to operate according to law, and law operates without variation. And when he aligned with law, the result was not uncertain, it was guaranteed. Alignment is not a single correction, it is a sequence of corrections, each one building on the last, each one removing another layer of interference. And with each correction, the signal becomes clearer. And as the signal becomes clearer, the response becomes stronger. Not because the system is rewarding progress, but because clarity produces resonance, and resonance amplifies. And amplification is not linear, it is exponential. Small increases in clarity produce large increases in result. Because the system is no longer fighting interference, it is processing signal. And signal, when clear, organizes outcomes automatically. Tesla did not wait for massive shifts. He corrected small deviations. And small deviations, when corrected consistently, prevent large collapses. And when large collapses do not occur, the system remains stable. And stable systems produce predictable results. And predictable results are the only results worth pursuing. Because unpredictable results are evidence of unresolved interference. And unresolved interference is evidence of incorrect sequence. And incorrect sequence is always correctable. The moment it is seen, correct the sequence and the outcome corrects itself. Silence is not absence. Silence is clarity. When a system is noisy, the signal is obscured. When a system is silent, the signal is all that remains. Tesla understood that most interference is self-generated. It is the constant mental activity that has no direction, the thoughts that repeat without purpose, the internal commentary that runs continuously without contributing to any outcome. And that noise is not harmless. Noise consumes energy, it scatters attention, and it prevents the system from stabilizing into a coherent frequency. Most people live in constant noise. They think they are thinking, but they are not. They are reacting to stimulus, reacting to memory, reacting to fear. And reaction is not thought. Reaction is automated pattern execution. And automated patterns are where misalignment lives. Because automated patterns were formed in response to conditions that no longer exist. And they continue to operate long after those conditions have changed. And they continue to produce results that reflect those old conditions. Not because the present demands it, but because the pattern was never interrupted. Silence is not something you create. Silence is what remains when noise is removed. And noise is removed not by suppressing it, but by ceasing to generate it. Most people try to quiet their minds through force. They try to stop thinking. But you cannot stop thinking by trying to stop thinking, because trying is itself a form of noise. Tesla did not try to quiet his mind. He redirected it. He gave his attention a single focus. And when attention is unified, noise disappears, not because it was suppressed, but because the conditions that produce it are no longer present. Noise is generated when attention is divided. When part of your mind is focused on one thing and another part is focused on something else, and the two parts are in conflict. And conflict generates interference, and interference generates noise, and noise prevents clarity, And without clarity, alignment is impossible, because you cannot align with what you cannot see, and you cannot see through noise. Signal stability is the condition under which the system can respond predictably. When the signal is unstable, the system does not know which frequency to amplify, so it amplifies none, or it amplifies whichever frequency is strongest in any given moment. And if the strongest frequency changes every few minutes, the system produces chaos, not because the system is broken, but because the input is incoherent. Tesla maintains signal stability not through effort, but through focus. Focus is not concentration. Concentration is force applied to attention. Focus is attention unified around a single frequency, and unified attention does not waver, it does not drift, it does not scatter. It remains stable because there is no internal competition. There is only one signal, and when there is only one signal, the system has no choice but to amplify it. And amplification is automatic once the signal is clear. But clarity requires silence, and silence requires that you stop generating noise. Most people are afraid of silence. They believe that silence is emptiness, that without constant mental activity, nothing will happen. But the opposite is true. Noise prevents things from happening. Noise is the interference that keeps the system from organizing, and when the noise stops, the system organizes immediately, not gradually, immediately, because the system was always trying to organize. It was simply unable to, because the signal was unclear, and the signal was unclear because the noise was louder than the signal. Tesla did not fear silence. He used it. He understood that silence was the condition under which clarity could emerge. And clarity is not something you think your way into. Clarity is what appears when thinking stops. Not all thinking, just unnecessary thinking. The mental loops, the repetitive patterns, the automatic responses that serve no function except to consume energy. And when those patterns are interrupted, energy is no longer consumed by noise. It is available for signal, and signal, when energy is available, strengthens automatically. Silence allows you to detect misalignment that noise obscures. When your mind is quiet, you can feel where the system is resisting. You can sense where the frequency is unstable. You can notice where your attention is being pulled in directions you did not choose. But when your mind is noisy, you feel nothing except the noise. And the noise convinces you that everything is fine, because noise creates the illusion of activity, and activity feels productive. But noise is not productive. Noise is consumptive. It consumes energy without producing movement. And the more noise you generate, the more energy you consume. And the more energy you consume, the less energy is available for alignment. And without energy, alignment cannot be maintained. And without alignment, the system produces whatever the noise dictates. And noise does not dictate coherence. Noise dictates disorder, always. How much of your mental activity is necessary? This is not a question of judgment. It is a question of observation. If you observe your thoughts for even 5 minutes, you will notice that most of them are repetitive. The same concerns, the same fears, the same rehearsals of past events, the same projections of future disaster. And none of this thinking produces clarity. It produces noise, and noise is not neutral. Noise is directional. It directs attention toward whatever is repeated most often, and what is repeated most often is almost always what you do not want. Because fear is louder than desire, doubt is louder than confidence, and the system, which amplifies frequency, amplifies what is loudest, not what is truest, not what is most aligned with your goal, but what is loudest. And if what is loudest is noise, the system produces noise, and noise when amplified becomes chaos. And chaos is the predictable result of an unstable signal. Tesla did not allow noise to dominate. He observed it, and observation does not require engagement. Observation is simply noticing, and noticing without reacting allows the noise to dissipate, because noise is sustained through reaction. When reaction stops, noise stops. Signal stability requires that you transmit one frequency at a time, not multiple frequencies simultaneously. not conflicting frequencies that cancel each other out. One frequency, clear, sustained, unwavering. And this is not possible when your attention is scattered. Scattered attention produces scattered signal, and scattered signal produces scattered results. Results that do not connect, results that do not build on each other, results that appear random. But they are not random. They are the exact reflection of the signal that produced them, and the signal was incoherent. Tesla maintained signal stability by refusing to allow his attention to scatter. He worked on one problem at a time. He thought about one principle at a time. He directed his energy toward one outcome at a time. And because his attention was unified, his signal was unified. And because his signal was unified, the results were coherent, not scattered, not random, but predictable. And predictability is the hallmark of a stable signal. When the signal is stable, the outcome is not in question. It is only a matter of time. And time, when the signal is stable, works in your favor, because stable signals compound, and compounding produces results that appear exponential. But they are not exponential, they are cumulative, and cumulative results are the natural outcome of sustained coherence. Silence is not the absence of thought. Silence is the absence of unnecessary thought. Unnecessary thought is any thought that does not contribute to alignment, any thought that opposes your stated goal, any thought that reinforces what you claim to reject, any thought that scatters your attention without producing clarity. And most thought is unnecessary, not because thinking is bad, but because most thinking is automatic. It is not chosen, it is triggered by stimulus, by memory, by habit. And automatic thinking does not serve you, it serves the pattern that generated it. And the pattern that generated it was formed in response to conditions that no longer exist. But the pattern continues, and it continues to produce results that reflect those old conditions. And those results are almost always misaligned with what you currently want, because what you currently want is not what the pattern was designed to produce. The pattern was designed to produce safety, or avoidance, or control, and those outcomes are not alignment. They are compensation, and compensation is not the same as coherence. Tesla practiced silence not as a spiritual discipline, but as a practical necessity. He understood that signal could not be maintained when the mind was noisy. And signal is everything. Signal determines what the system amplifies, and if the system is amplifying noise, the result is disorder. But if the system is amplifying signal, the result is order. And order is not something you force. Order is what emerges when noise is absent. Tesla did not force order. He removed noise, and the moment noise was removed, order appeared, automatically. Not because he created it, but because order is the natural state of a system when interference is absent. And interference is always noise, always internal, always self-generated, and always optional. You do not have to generate noise. You generate it because you have not learned to stop. And stopping does not require effort. Stopping requires awareness. Awareness that the noise is present. Awareness that the noise is serving no function. And awareness that the noise can be interrupted simply by redirecting attention towards something coherent. Stability is not excitement. Stability is calm. And calm is not passive. Calm is the condition under which the system can process signal without distortion. When the system is calm, the signal is transmitted clearly. When the system is agitated, the signal is distorted, and distorted signals produce distorted results. Not because the goal was wrong, but because the transmission was unclear. Tesla was not excitable, he was precise, and precision requires calm. Because calm allows you to detect small deviations before they become large ones. And small deviations are always correctable. But small deviations go unnoticed when the system is noisy, because noise drowns out the subtle signals that indicate drift. And drift, when unnoticed, compounds. And compounded drift is what most people call failure. But failure is not a single event. Failure is the accumulated result of uncorrected drift. And drift is always detectable. if the system is quiet enough to detect it, and the system is only quiet when noise is absent, and noise is absent only when you stop generating it. Signal stability does not mean rigidity. Stability means coherence. A stable signal can shift, but it shifts intentionally, not reactively. It shifts because the conditions have changed, and alignment requires adjustment. But reactive shifting is not adjustment. Reactive shifting is noise. It is the automatic response to stimulus. And automatic responses are where misalignment lives, because automatic responses were formed without awareness. And what was formed without awareness cannot serve alignment. It can only serve the pattern that generated it. And the pattern was almost always formed in response to threat. And threat-based patterns do not produce coherent outcomes. They produce survival outcomes. And survival is not the same as alignment. Survival is avoiding what you fear. Alignment is moving toward what you want. And these are not the same direction. And when direction is unclear, the signal is unstable. And unstable signals produce unpredictable results. And unpredictable results are proof that the signal was never coherent. Silence and stability are not states you achieve once and then forget. They are conditions you maintain continuously. Tesla maintained them not because he was disciplined, but because he understood that without them, alignment was impossible. And without alignment, all effort was wasted. And waste was unacceptable. Not morally unacceptable, mechanically unacceptable, because wasted energy is energy that could have been used to produce the desired outcome. And every moment spent generating noise is a moment where energy is wasted. And wasted energy does not return. It is gone, converted into heat, into friction, into disorder. And disorder, once created, must be corrected. And correction requires energy. So noise does not just waste the energy used to generate it. It also wastes the energy required to correct the disorder it produced. This is the cost of noise. And the cost is not small. It is enormous. And it compounds daily. And most people never calculate it, because they never stop long enough to observe how much energy they are spending on nothing. When the signal is stable, the system responds with precision. Not with approximation, not with delay, but with precision. And precision is what makes results predictable. And predictable results are the only results that allow you to plan, to build, to compound, because you know what the system will produce. And knowing what the system will produce allows you to arrange conditions so that what the system produces is useful. Tesla arranged conditions. He did not hope for useful results. He designed systems so that useful results were the only possible outcome. And design requires silence, because design requires that you see the structure clearly. And structure is not visible through noise. Structure is only visible in silence. And silence is not something you wait for. Silence is something you create by refusing to generate noise. Stable signal requires sustained silence. Identity is not what you think you are. Identity is what you transmit most consistently. It is the frequency you hold when no one is watching, the pattern you return to when you are not consciously choosing, the default state that operates automatically when awareness is absent, and that default state is structure. It is not personality. It is not character. It is the accumulated result of every thought you have repeated, every belief you have reinforced, and every action you have taken without questioning. Tesla understood that identity is not fixed. Identity is frequency made structural, and structure can be rebuilt. Not through affirmation, not through wishful thinking, but through the systematic elimination of every pattern that does not serve the outcome you want. And elimination is not suppression. Elimination is the conscious decision to stop feeding a pattern until it weakens to the point where it no longer asserts itself automatically. And once it no longer asserts itself, it is no longer part of your structure. And once it is no longer part of your structure, it is no longer part of your identity. Most people believe their identity is permanent. They believe they are the way they are because of history, because of genetics, because of circumstance. And they use that belief as justification for why they cannot change. But identity is not history. Identity is frequency, and frequency is present tense. It is what you are transmitting right now, not what you transmitted 10 years ago, not what you will transmit tomorrow, but what is active in this moment. And what is active in this moment is either aligned with what you want or it is not. And if it is not, the system will produce results that reflect the misalignment, not because your past determines your future, but because your present frequency determines your present outcome, and your present outcome becomes your future condition, not through destiny, through mechanics. Tesla did not believe in destiny. He believed in design. And design is the act of arranging frequency so that the outcome is inevitable. And inevitable outcomes are not determined by who you were. They are determined by what you transmit now. Identity in a coherent system is not effort. It is expression. When the system is aligned, you do not need to force yourself to behave in ways that support your goals. The behavior emerges automatically because the behavior is the natural expression of the frequency you hold. Tesla did not force himself to think like an inventor. He arranged his internal state so that invention was the natural output. And arrangement is not the same as motivation. Motivation is temporary. Motivation requires renewal. Arrangement is structural, and structures do not require renewal. They require only that the conditions that would destabilize them remain absent, and those conditions are always internal. They are thoughts that oppose the structure, beliefs that contradict it, patterns that undermine it. And when those conditions are kept absent, the structure remains stable, and stable structures produce consistent results, and consistent results reinforce the structure, and reinforced structures become identity, not because you declared them, but because they operate automatically. Most people construct identity backward. They decide who they want to be, and then try to act like that person. But acting is not identity. Acting is performance, and performance is exhausting, because performance requires that you maintain a version of yourself that is not structural. It is imposed, and imposed states do not sustain themselves. They collapse the moment effort decreases. Tesla did not perform. He restructured. He identified the frequency that would produce the outcomes he wanted, and then he eliminated every frequency that opposed it. And once opposition was eliminated, the desired frequency was all that remained. And what remains when opposition is eliminated is not something you maintain through effort. It is something that operates automatically, because it is the only frequency present. And the system always amplifies what is present, not what is intended, not what is performed, but what is actually transmitted. And what is transmitted is determined by structure. And structure is either coherent or it is not. And if it is not, no amount of performance will make it appear coherent. Identity is revealed through consistency, not through declaration. You are not what you say you are. You are what you do when no decision is required, when the action is automatic, when the response is immediate. That is identity. And that identity is either aligned with your stated goals or it is not. And if it is not, the stated goals will not be achieved. Not because you are incapable, but because the identity that is operating does not support them. An identity that does not support your goals is not a flaw. It is simply a frequency that was formed in response to different conditions. Conditions that prioritize safety over growth, avoidance over pursuit, certainty over possibility. And those priorities are not wrong. They were adaptive at the time they were formed. But they are not adaptive now. And non-adaptive patterns do not disappear on their own. They continue to operate until they are consciously interrupted. An interruption is not dramatic. Interruption is simply the act of noticing when the pattern asserts itself and choosing not to follow it. Not once, but every time, until the pattern weakens. And once weakened, it no longer competes with the new frequency. And the new frequency, when unopposed, becomes structure, and structure becomes identity. What do you do when no one is watching? This is not a question of morality. It is a question of structure. When external pressure is absent, what remains is internal structure. And internal structure is identity. If your internal structure is aligned with your stated goals, you do not need external pressure. The action occurs automatically, But if your internal structure is misaligned, external pressure is the only thing that produces action, and action that requires external pressure is not sustainable, because external pressure is variable. It increases and decreases, and when it decreases, action stops, and when action stops, the result stops, and when the result stops, the goal is not achieved. Tesla did not rely on external pressure. He built internal structure. And internal structure does not require pressure. It requires only that interference be absent. And interference is absent when contradictory frequencies are eliminated. And elimination is not a one-time event. Elimination is a continuous practice. It is the act of observing when a contradictory frequency asserts itself and refusing to feed it. Not through force, through redirection. And redirection, when practiced consistently, weakens the old pattern. And weakened patterns do not dominate, they fade. And when they fade, the new pattern is all that remains. And what remains becomes automatic. And automatic patterns are identity. Identity in a coherent system does not feel like identity. It feels like inevitability. You do not think about whether to act. You act. You do not deliberate about whether the action aligns with your goal. The action is the expression of the goal, because the goal is not separate from you. The goal is the natural outcome of the frequency you hold, and the frequency you hold is structural. It is not chosen moment to moment. It operates continuously, and it produces results continuously. Not results you think about, results you live. Tesla did not think about whether his work aligned with his principles. His work was the expression of his principles. Because his principles were structural, they were not beliefs he held consciously. They were frequencies that operated automatically, and automatic frequencies produce automatic results, and automatic results are the only results that compound over time. Because they do not require decision, they do not require motivation. They require only that the structure remain intact, and structure remains intact when opposition is absent. Most people experience identity as conflict. They want one thing and do another. They declare one priority and live another. And they feel the conflict as tension, as internal resistance, as the sensation that they are divided. And they are divided, not because they are broken, but because they are transmitting two frequencies simultaneously, and two frequencies transmitted simultaneously do not produce two results. They produce interference, and interference produces heat, and heat is the sensation of conflict, the sensation that effort is required just to maintain basic function. Tesla did not experience this conflict, not because he was exceptional, but because he eliminated one of the frequencies. He did not try to hold two opposing frequencies and manage the interference. He identified which frequency served his goal and which frequency opposed it, and he eliminated the one that opposed it. And elimination is not suppression. Suppression is holding the frequency down while it continues to assert itself. Elimination is withdrawing attention until the frequency weakens to the point where it no longer asserts itself. And once it no longer asserts itself, the conflict disappears. Not because you resolved it, because one side of the conflict no longer exists. Identity is not who you hope to become. Identity is who you are when you are not trying. And who you are when you are not trying is determined by the structure you have built through repetition. Not through decision, but through repetition. Every thought you repeat builds structure. Every action you repeat builds structure. And structure, once built, operates automatically. It does not ask for permission, it does not wait for motivation, it simply executes. And what it executes is whatever pattern has been repeated most often. And the pattern that has been repeated most often is almost always not the pattern you consciously chose. It is the pattern that was formed in response to conditions you did not choose. Conditions that required adaptation. And adaptation is not alignment. Adaptation is survival. And survival patterns do not produce aligned outcomes. They produce safe outcomes. And safe outcomes are not always the outcomes you want. Tesla did not optimize for safety. He optimized for coherence. And coherence is not safe. Coherence is precise. And precision requires that you eliminate every frequency that does not serve the outcome, even if that frequency once served you, even if that frequency feels familiar, even if eliminating it feels like losing part of yourself, because you are not losing part of yourself. You are losing a pattern, and patterns are not you. Patterns are structures, and structures can be rebuilt. Identity in a coherent system is not fixed, it is fluid. But fluid does not mean unstable. Fluid means responsive. It means that when conditions change, the structure adjusts, not reactively, but intentionally, not through automatic response, but through conscious observation. Tesla adjusted continuously. He did not hold to a structure simply because it had worked in the past. He observed whether the structure was still producing the desired outcome, and when it was not, he adjusted. Not the goal, the structure, because the goal was fixed, the outcome was fixed, but the structure required to produce that outcome was variable. And variable structure requires continuous observation. Observation of where the system is drifting. Observation of where new interference is forming. Observation of where old patterns are reasserting themselves. And when drift is observed, correction occurs, immediately, not later, not after the drift has compounded, but in the moment it is detected. Because drift, when corrected immediately, requires minimal adjustment. The same drift allowed to compound requires complete reconstruction, and reconstruction is costly, not impossible, but costly, and cost is always measured in time and energy, and time and energy are the only resources you have, and wasting them is not neutral, wasting them is destructive. Identity is the frequency you hold when nothing is demanding your attention, when there is no crisis, no deadline, no external structure. What do you default to? That is your identity, and that identity is producing results, not the results you say you want, the results that correspond to the frequency you actually hold. And if those results do not match what you say you want, the problem is not the system. The system is responding correctly. The problem is the frequency, and the frequency is structural, and structure is not changed through declaration. Structure is changed through elimination and reconstruction. Elimination of patterns that oppose the goal. Reconstruction through the repetition of patterns that support it. And repetition is not effort. Repetition is simply the act of returning attention to the new pattern every time the old pattern asserts itself. And the old pattern will assert itself, not because you are failing, but because the old pattern is structural, and structural patterns do not disappear immediately. They weaken gradually, and they weaken only when they are no longer fed, and they are no longer fed when attention is redirected every time they appear. And redirection practiced consistently is how new structure is built, and new structure once built is identity. When identity is aligned with outcome, there is no effort, there is only expression. The outcome does not feel like an achievement, it feels like the natural result of who you are. Not who you pretend to be, not who you hope to become, but who you are structurally. And structural identity is the only identity that lasts, because it does not require maintenance. It requires only that opposition remain absent. And opposition remains absent when contradictory frequencies are not allowed to reassert themselves. And they are not allowed to reassert themselves when you observe their appearance and refuse to follow them, not through force, through awareness. And awareness sustained over time is how coherence becomes permanent, not because the structure is rigid, but because the structure is stable, and stable structures produce predictable results, and predictable results are the foundation of every outcome worth pursuing. Identity is frequency made structural. There comes a point where management is no longer necessary, where the system operates without supervision, where outcomes appear without intervention. This is not automation, this is alignment sustained long enough that the structure has stabilized into a state where deviation is no longer possible. Not because deviation is prevented, but because the conditions that produce deviation are absent. Tesla reached this point in every system he designed. Once the design was complete, the system performed exactly as intended, not because he monitored it, but because the design left no room for error. Every variable was accounted for, every potential source of interference was eliminated, and what remained was a system that could only produce one result, the intended result. And that result appeared automatically, not because the system was controlled, but because the system was coherent. And coherent systems do not require management. They require only that the coherence be maintained, and coherence is maintained not through effort, but through the absence of disruption. Most people never reach this point. They spend their entire lives managing outcomes, adjusting circumstances, intervening when things drift, and they believe this is normal. They believe that without constant management, everything would collapse, and they are correct. But not because management is necessary, because alignment was never achieved. What they are managing is not a coherent system. What they are managing is organized chaos, a set of contradictory frequencies held together through force, and force is not sustainable. Eventually the force diminishes, and when it does, the system collapses into whatever state the underlying frequency supports. And if the underlying frequency is incoherent, the collapse is total. Tesla did not build systems that required force to hold together. He built systems where force was irrelevant, because the components were aligned with each other and with the governing principle, and when alignment is complete, the system sustains itself, not for a day, not for a year, but indefinitely, until something disrupts the alignment. And if nothing disrupts the alignment, no disruption occurs. Events that no longer require management are not rare events. They are the natural outcome of coherent frequency sustained over time. When frequency is coherent, the system organizes around it, not gradually, continuously. Every moment the frequency remains stable, the system adjusts to match it. And as the system adjusts, outcomes begin to appear that reflect the frequency, not outcomes you forced, outcomes that emerged naturally because the conditions supported them. And as those outcomes appear, they reinforce the frequency, and reinforced frequency becomes more stable, and more stable frequency produces more coherent outcomes, and more coherent outcomes require less intervention, until eventually intervention is no longer necessary, because the system has organized to the point where the desired outcome is the only outcome the system can produce. Tesla understood this cycle. He did not intervene constantly. He aligned once, and once aligned, the system produced results without further input. And the results were not approximate, they were exact, because the system had no other option. Management is evidence of instability. When a system is stable, management is irrelevant. The system does what it does, predictably, consistently, without deviation, and deviation is the only thing that requires management. But deviation does not occur in a system where all variables are aligned. Deviation occurs when one variable drifts out of alignment with the others, and drift occurs when the conditions that maintain alignment are allowed to weaken. Tesla did not allow conditions to weaken. He observed them, and observation is not management. Observation is awareness of state. When the state is aligned, no action is required. When the state begins to drift, correction occurs. Not dramatic correction, minimal correction, because drift, when detected early, requires minimal adjustment. The same drift allowed to compound requires complete reconstruction, and reconstruction is what most people call management. But reconstruction is not management. Reconstruction is emergency response, and emergency response is required only when observation was absent, and observation is absent when attention is scattered, and scattered attention is the result of incoherent frequency, and incoherent frequency is what produces the need for management in the first place. When does something stop requiring your attention? When the structure is aligned and the frequency is stable. Until that point, attention is required. Not constant attention, but periodic attention. Attention to detect drift. Attention to observe where the system is deviating. Attention to correct before the deviation becomes structural. But once the structure is aligned and the frequency is stable, drift stops occurring. not because the system is rigid, but because the system has reached its most stable configuration. And stable configurations do not drift randomly. They remain stable until something disrupts them. And if nothing disrupts them, they remain stable indefinitely. Tesla built systems that reached stable configuration quickly. He did not spend years refining, he spent time designing. And once the design was correct, implementation was rapid. And once implementation was complete, the system operated without supervision, because the design had accounted for every variable. And when every variable is accounted for, there are no surprises. There is only the predictable unfolding of cause and effect, and cause and effect do not require management. They require only that the cause remains stable, and the cause is always frequency. Most people confuse activity with progress. They believe that if they are constantly doing something, they are moving forward. But activity is not progress. Activity is movement, and movement is not directional unless frequency is aligned. When frequency is misaligned, activity produces heat. It produces exhaustion. It produces the sensation of effort. But it does not produce results that accumulate, because the results are not coherent. They do not build on each other, they scatter, and scattered results do not compound, they dissipate. Tesla did not value activity. He valued alignment, and alignment produces progress, without requiring constant activity. Because aligned systems produce results automatically, the results do not require you to do anything except maintain the alignment. And maintaining alignment does not require activity. It requires awareness. Awareness of when the frequency is shifting. And when the frequency is shifting, correction occurs. Not through activity, but through redirection. Redirection of attention back to the aligned state. And redirection is not effort. Redirection is precision, and precision, when practiced consistently, eliminates the need for activity, because the system stabilizes, and stable systems do not require constant input, they require only that disruption remain absent. What would your life look like if nothing required management? This is not a hypothetical question. It is the natural outcome of sustained alignment. When frequency is coherent and structure is stable, management becomes irrelevant, not because problems disappear, but because problems do not form. Problems are the result of misalignment compounded over time. When alignment is present, compounding produces coherence, not problems. And coherence does not require solutions. Coherence is the solution. It is the state where every variable supports every other variable, where no internal opposition exists, where the system operates as a unified whole, rather than as a collection of conflicting parts. And unified systems do not break down. They do not require repair. They do not drift into dysfunction. They remain stable because stability is their natural state when interference is absent. And interference is absent when contradictory frequencies are not allowed to exist within the system. Tesla did not allow contradictory frequencies. He identified them before they became structural, and he eliminated them immediately. And elimination is not suppression. Elimination is the removal of the conditions that allow the contradictory frequency to exist. And once those conditions are removed, the contradictory frequency ceases to exist. And once it ceases to exist, it cannot produce interference. And without interference, stability is automatic. Events that no longer require management are not passive events. They are active events that occur automatically. Automatically does not mean without cause. Automatically means that the cause is structural rather than conscious. The system is producing the result not because you are making it happen, but because the structure makes it inevitable. And inevitability is the highest form of efficiency, because inevitability does not require decision. It does not require motivation. It does not require willpower. It requires only that the structure remain intact. And structure remains intact when the frequency that created it remains stable. And frequency remains stable when attention is not scattered. And attention is not scattered when there is no internal conflict. And internal conflict is absent when contradictory frequencies have been eliminated. This is the sequence. And the sequence produces a state where outcomes appear without effort. not because effort is unnecessary in general, but because the effort was applied at the correct point, the point of structure, not the point of outcome. An effort applied at the point of structure produces outcomes that do not require further effort, because the structure sustains itself. Tesla did not spend his time managing his inventions after they were complete. He spent his time designing the next one, because completed designs did not require management. They required only that the conditions remain stable, and the conditions remained stable because he had eliminated every variable that would destabilize them. And once eliminated, those variables did not return, not because he prevented their return, but because the system no longer had space for them. The system was complete. Every component was aligned. Every frequency was coherent. And coherent systems do not admit incoherent elements, not through rejection, but through structural incompatibility. An incoherent element introduced into a coherent system either becomes coherent or it is expelled. Not through force but through mechanics. The system simply does not support it, and what the system does not support cannot exist within it. This is not philosophy, this is physics, and physics operates whether you understand it or not, and it produces results that correspond to structure, always, without exception, without delay. Most people live in a state of constant management because they never stabilized the structure. They built on a foundation that was misaligned, and everything built on a misaligned foundation requires constant adjustment to prevent collapse. And constant adjustment is exhausting, not because adjustment is inherently exhausting, but because adjustment is being applied at the wrong level. Adjustment applied at the level of outcome is temporary. Adjustment applied at the level of structure is permanent, and permanent adjustment is not adjustment, it is correction. And correction, when complete, eliminates the need for further adjustment. Tesla corrected at the level of structure. He did not adjust outcomes. He rebuilt foundations. And rebuilt foundations do not require adjustment. They require only that they not be undermined. And they are not undermined when contradictory frequencies are not introduced. And contradictory frequencies are not introduced when observation is continuous. And observation is continuous when attention is not divided. And attention is not divided when the frequency you hold is singular. And singular frequency is the only frequency that produces outcomes that sustain themselves. Management is the cost of incomplete alignment. When alignment is complete, management is unnecessary. The system produces what it produces, without supervision, without intervention, without constant course correction. And what it produces is exactly what the structure was designed to produce. Not approximately. Exactly, because the structure leaves no room for variation. Variation is the result of loose tolerances, of components that are not precisely aligned, of frequencies that are close but not identical. And close is not sufficient. Close produces drift, and drift produces deviation, and deviation produces the need for management. Tesla did not accept close. He accepted only precise, and precise does not drift. Precise remains precise until something disrupts it. And if nothing disrupts it, it remains precise indefinitely. And precision sustained indefinitely produces results that appear miraculous. But they are not miraculous. They are mechanical. They are the predictable outcome of structure aligned with principle. And principle is law. And law does not fail. Law operates continuously, and it produces results continuously, and the results are always coherent when the structure is aligned, and aligned structure is the only structure worth building, because misaligned structure, no matter how much effort is applied, will never produce the outcome alignment would produce automatically. When alignment is complete and structure is stable, life does not require management. It requires only that the frequency be maintained. And frequency is maintained not through effort, but through refusal. Refusal to introduce contradiction. Refusal to scatter attention. Refusal to feed patterns that oppose the aligned state. And refusal is not suppression. Refusal is clarity. It is the recognition that certain thoughts, certain beliefs, certain actions do not serve the outcome. And the recognition is enough. Because once seen, they lose their power. They no longer assert themselves automatically. They can still appear, but they appear as options, not as commands. And options can be declined, and when declined consistently, they stop appearing, not because you fought them, but because you stopped feeding them. And patterns that are not fed weaken, and weakened patterns do not dominate. And when patterns that oppose alignment do not dominate, the pattern that supports alignment is all that remains, and what remains becomes automatic. And automatic alignment produces outcomes that do not require management. They require only that you remain aligned. And remaining aligned is not effort, it is state. And state, once achieved, sustains itself until disruption is introduced. And if disruption is never introduced, the state persists indefinitely. Aligned systems produce outcomes without management. There is a state where things fall into place, not because you arranged them, but because the conditions made any other configuration impossible. This is not luck. This is not coincidence. This is the natural outcome of frequency sustained long enough that the system has no choice but to organize around it. Tesla observed this repeatedly. Once his systems were aligned, components began to function in ways he had not explicitly programmed. Not because the components were intelligent, but because the structure left only one path for energy to follow. And energy, when given a clear path, follows it automatically. It does not hesitate. It does not deviate. It moves along the path of least resistance. And when all paths except one have been eliminated, the path of least resistance is the path you designed. And the outcome is not uncertain. It is guaranteed, not through control, but through elimination. Elimination of every condition that would produce a different result. And once those conditions are eliminated, only one result remains possible. And that result appears. Not because you forced it, but because nothing else could appear. Most people never reach this state because they never maintain frequency long enough for the system to stabilize. They align for a day. They transmit coherence for a week. And then they revert. They allow old patterns to reassert themselves. They permit contradictory thoughts to re-enter the system. And the moment contradiction re-enters, the system destabilizes. Not dramatically, gradually. And gradual destabilization is almost invisible. You do not notice it happening. You only notice the result. And the result is that things stop falling into place. Opportunities that would have appeared do not appear. Outcomes that would have organized naturally remain scattered. And you conclude that the principle does not work. But the principle always works. The frequency was not sustained. And frequency that is not sustained does not produce sustained results. It produces sporadic results. And sporadic results do not compound. They scatter. And scattered results do not create momentum. They create confusion. And confusion is the predictable outcome of inconsistent frequency. Tesla did not transmit inconsistently. He transmitted continuously. And continuous transmission is what produces the state where things fall into place. Alignment is not a single threshold you cross. Alignment is a state you inhabit, and inhabiting that state requires that you remain in it. Not for an hour, not for a day, but continuously, until the state becomes structural, until the frequency you transmit is no longer something you choose moment to moment, but something that operates automatically. An automatic transmission is the only transmission that produces results that accumulate without effort. Because automatic transmission does not require decision, it does not require motivation, it operates whether you are paying attention or not. And when transmission is automatic, the system responds continuously, not just when you are focused, not just when you are trying, but always. And continuous response produces continuous results. And continuous results over time create a life where things fall into place, not occasionally, consistently, not through effort, through structure. And structure is what remains when frequency has been sustained long enough to become permanent. The state where things fall into place is not passive, it is active. But the action is not yours. The action belongs to the system. The system is organizing. The system is responding. The system is producing outcomes that reflect the frequency you have sustained. And those outcomes appear, not because you made them appear, but because the frequency made them inevitable. Tesla did not make his inventions work. He created the conditions under which they could only work, and once those conditions were present, the inventions performed exactly as designed, not because he was present, but because the design was complete, and complete designs do not require supervision. They require only that the conditions remain stable, and conditions remain stable when frequency remains coherent, and frequency remains coherent when contradiction is absent, and contradiction is absent when it is not fed, and it is not fed when attention is redirected every time it appears. And redirection, practiced continuously, is how frequency becomes structural, and structural frequency produces outcomes that do not require your involvement. They appear automatically because the system has organized around the frequency you sustained. Inevitability is not fatalism. Inevitability is the natural outcome of aligned structure. When structure is aligned, certain results become unavoidable, not because fate demands them, but because the mechanics demand them. The system has no other option. Every variable points in the same direction. Every component supports every other component. And when all components support each other, the system produces the result it was designed to produce. Not sometimes, always. And always is not a hopeful word. Always is a mechanical word. It describes what happens when conditions are correct, and conditions are correct when frequency is aligned. And frequency is aligned when internal opposition has been eliminated. Tesla eliminated internal opposition not through force but through clarity. He saw where opposition existed, and he removed it, not by fighting it, but by withdrawing the conditions that sustained it. And once those conditions were withdrawn, opposition ceased to exist. And once opposition ceased to exist, the system had no choice but to move in the direction the aligned frequency demanded. And that direction was always toward the intended outcome, not approximately, exactly. When does effort become irrelevant? When alignment has been sustained long enough that the system operates automatically. Effort is required only when the system is not yet aligned, when components are still opposing each other, when frequency is still unstable, when contradiction is still present. But once alignment is achieved and sustained, effort is no longer the variable that matters. The variable that matters is maintenance, and maintenance is not effort. Maintenance is observation. It is the act of noticing when something begins to drift and correcting it before the drift becomes structural. And drift, when detected immediately, requires no effort to correct. It requires only redirection, a shift of attention, a return to the aligned state, and return is not difficult when the aligned state is familiar, when it has been inhabited long enough to become automatic. Tesla inhabited alignment continuously, not because he was disciplined, but because he had eliminated every reason to leave it. And when there is no reason to leave alignment, alignment persists, and persistent alignment produces results that do not require effort. They require only that the alignment be maintained. And alignment is maintained not through force but through refusal to introduce the conditions that would destabilize it. How much of your life is spent forcing versus allowing? Forcing is evidence that alignment is incomplete. When alignment is complete, allowing is all that remains. Allowing is not passivity. Allowing is the recognition that the system will produce the result if you do not interfere. And interference is almost always well-intentioned. It is the belief that if you do not intervene, the outcome will not appear. But this belief is itself interference. It assumes that the system requires your constant input, and that assumption prevents you from seeing that the system is already responding. It is already organizing. It is already producing the outcome, and your intervention is not helping. It is disrupting, because your intervention is based on the belief that the current trajectory is wrong, and that belief introduces doubt. And doubt is a frequency, and that frequency opposes the aligned frequency you have been sustaining. And opposition destabilizes, and destabilization is what requires effort to correct. Tesla did not intervene in his systems once they were aligned. He allowed them to operate, and operation when the system is aligned produces exactly what the design specified. Not because he allowed it, but because the system had no other option. Things fall into place when resistance has been eliminated, and frequency has been sustained long enough that the system has reorganized completely. Complete reorganization is not immediate, it is cumulative. Every moment the frequency remains stable, the system adjusts slightly, and slight adjustments compounded over time produce total transformation, not dramatic transformation, structural transformation, the kind that is invisible while it is occurring, but undeniable once complete. Tesla understood that transformation is not an event. Transformation is a process, and the process is mechanical. It operates according to principles that do not vary, and the principles demand only that frequency remains stable, not perfect. Stable, and stable does not mean rigid. Stable means coherent. It means that all variables are aligned, that no internal opposition exists, that the signal is clear and sustained. And when the signal is clear and sustained, the system has no choice but to respond, and the response is not random. The response is precise, and precision compounded over time produces outcomes that appear effortless, but they are not effortless. They are the result of effort applied at the correct point, the point of structure, not the point of outcome. And effort applied at the point of structure produces outcomes that sustain themselves. The state where things fall into place is not a destination, it is a condition, and the condition is maintained through continuous coherence. Coherence is not something you achieve and then forget. Coherence is something you inhabit, and inhabiting coherence requires that you remain in it, not through struggle, but through refusal. Refusal to scatter attention, refusal to entertain contradiction, refusal to feed patterns that oppose the aligned state. And refusal is not suppression. Refusal is redirection. It is the act of noticing when the mind drifts toward incoherence and redirecting it toward coherence. And redirection is not effort when the coherent state is familiar, when it has been inhabited long enough to become the default. And the default state is where identity lives. And identity is what operates automatically. And automatic operation is what produces the state where things fall into place. Not because you are special, but because the structure you have built leaves no other option. And when no other option exists, the outcome is not uncertain, it is inevitable. Tesla did not hope things would fall into place. He designed systems so that things could only fall into place. And design is not wishful thinking. Design is the systematic elimination of every variable that would produce a different outcome. And elimination is not complicated. Elimination is observation followed by action. Observation of where misalignment exists. Action to remove it, not to fight it, to remove it, by withdrawing the conditions that sustain it. And once those conditions are withdrawn, misalignment ceases to exist. And once misalignment ceases to exist, alignment is all that remains. And alignment, when it is all that remains, operates automatically. It does not require decision. It does not require effort. It does not require management. It requires only that the conditions that would produce misalignment remain absent. And those conditions remain absent when you refuse to introduce them. And refusal is not a single act. Refusal is a continuous practice. It is the practice of remaining in the aligned state, and remaining in the aligned state is how things fall into place. Not through magic, through mechanics, through frequency sustained long enough that the system has no choice but to reorganize around it. When alignment is sustained and effort becomes irrelevant, what remains is not emptiness. What remains is flow. Flow is not the absence of activity. Flow is activity without resistance. It is movement without friction. It is progress without effort. And flow is the natural state of an aligned system. It is not something you create. It is what appears when interference is removed. And interference is removed when contradictory frequencies are eliminated. And contradictory frequencies are eliminated when they are no longer fed. And they are no longer fed when attention is redirected every time they appear. And redirection practiced continuously is how flow becomes permanent. And permanent flow is the state where things fall into place. Not occasionally, continuously. Not through hope, through structure. And structure is what frequency becomes when it is sustained long enough to reorganize the system completely. And complete reorganization is not something you do. It is something the system does in response to the frequency you hold. And the frequency you hold is either aligned or it is not. And if it is aligned and sustained, the system reorganizes. And reorganized systems produce outcomes that do not require management. They produce outcomes that appear automatically, because the structure leaves no other possibility. Things fall into place, not when you try harder, but when you align completely. And complete alignment is not perfection. Complete alignment is the elimination of opposition, the removal of contradiction, the refusal to feed patterns that oppose the outcome. And when opposition is absent, the system has a clear path, and a clear path is all energy needs. Energy does not need motivation. Energy does not need encouragement. Energy needs only direction. And direction is provided by frequency. And frequency is either clear or it is not. And if it is clear, energy follows it automatically. And energy following a clear path produces results that accumulate without effort. And accumulated results are what most people call success. But success is not an achievement. Success is a state, the state where frequency is aligned and sustained. And sustained frequency produces outcomes that fall into place, not because you deserve them, because the mechanics demand them. Sustained alignment makes outcomes inevitable. Life in coherence is not what most people imagine. It is not constant excitement. It is not perpetual achievement. It is not the absence of challenge. Life in coherence is the state where the system operates according to its design, without requiring constant intervention, where outcomes appear, not because you forced them, but because the conditions made them inevitable, where effort is applied not to manage results, but to maintain frequency, and frequency, once stabilized, does not require the kind of effort most people associate with success. It requires attention, precision, and the refusal to reintroduce the patterns that produce incoherence. Tesla lived in this state, not because he was exceptional, but because he had eliminated every condition that would prevent it. He did not tolerate contradiction. He did not scatter his attention. He did not feed patterns that opposed his goals. And because he did not introduce incoherence, coherence persisted. And persistent coherence produced a life where the work he did was the natural expression of the frequency he held, not work he forced himself to do, work that emerged automatically because the structure supported it. Most people pursue coherence as if it were a distant goal, something to achieve someday when conditions are right. But coherence is not a future state. Coherence is present or it is not, and it is present when contradiction is absent. And contradiction is absent when it is not fed, and it is not fed when attention is redirected every time it appears. This is not a process that takes years. This is a process that occurs in every moment. Every moment you choose alignment over contradiction, coherence increases. Every moment you choose scattered attention over focused transmission, coherence decreases. And the life you live is the accumulated result of those moments. Not the moments you planned, not the moments you hoped for, but the moments you actually inhabited. And the moments you actually inhabited were determined by the frequency you held, not the frequency you declared, the frequency that was structurally present. And structural frequency is revealed not by intention, but by result. If the result is coherence, the frequency was aligned. If the result is disorder, the frequency was not. When frequency is mastered, outcomes fall into place because the system has organized completely around that frequency. Complete organization is not partial, it is total. Every element of the system aligns with every other element, every thought supports the goal, every action reinforces the structure. Every pattern operates in the same direction, and when all elements move in the same direction, resistance disappears, not because resistance was overcome, but because the conditions that produce resistance are no longer present. And without resistance, energy is not converted into heat, it is converted into work, and work produces visible results, not approximate results, exact results, because the system is producing what it was designed to produce, and what it was designed to produce is determined by frequency, and frequency is determined by what you hold most consistently, not what you say most often, what you hold, and what you hold is revealed by where your attention returns when it is not being directed, and where it returns is either aligned with your goal, or it is not. And if it is not, the system will produce results that reflect the misalignment, always, without exception, without delay. Mastering frequency is not mastering a technique, it is mastering state. State is not something you do, state is something you are, and what you are is determined by structure, and structure is determined by repetition, and repetition is determined by attention, and attention is either scattered or unified, and unified attention produces coherent frequency, and coherent frequency produces coherent results, and coherent results compound, and compounding produces transformation, not dramatic transformation, cumulative transformation, the kind that is invisible day to day, but undeniable year to year. Tesla did not transform himself through dramatic acts. He transformed himself through continuous alignment, alignment practiced daily, alignment maintained hourly, alignment that became so automatic it was no longer something he thought about. It was simply how he operated, and automatic operation is the only operation that lasts. Because automatic operation does not require decision. It does not require willpower. It does not require motivation. It operates whether you are paying attention or not. And when operation is automatic, results are continuous, and continuous results produce a life that does not feel like struggle. It feels like expression. Life in coherence is life where the internal state matches the external result. Not approximately, exactly. When the internal state is aligned, the external result reflects that alignment. When the internal state is incoherent, the external result reflects that incoherence, and the reflection is not delayed, it is immediate. But most people do not see the reflection because they are not observing their internal state. They are observing their external circumstances, and they conclude that the circumstances are the cause. But circumstances are never the cause. Circumstances are the effect. The cause is always frequency, and frequency is always internal, and internal frequency is either coherent or it is not. And if it is not, no external circumstance will produce coherence, because coherence is not something you acquire from outside. Coherence is something you generate from within, and generation is not accidental. Generation is structural. It is the result of eliminating contradiction and sustaining alignment long enough for the system to stabilize. And stabilized systems produce stable results. And stable results are the foundation of every life worth living. Tesla understood that mastery is not complexity. Mastery is simplicity sustained. Simple does not mean easy. Simple means that all variables point in one direction, that no internal opposition exists, that the system has been reduced to its essential elements, and essential elements do not conflict, they support. And when all elements support each other, the system operates at maximum efficiency. Maximum efficiency is not maximum effort. Maximum efficiency is minimum waste. And waste is eliminated when misalignment is eliminated. And misalignment is eliminated when it is identified and removed. Not managed, removed. And removal is permanent when the conditions that allowed the misalignment to exist are withdrawn. And those conditions are always internal. They are thoughts that oppose goals, beliefs that contradict intentions, patterns that undermine stated direction, and those conditions exist only because they are fed, and they are fed only because attention is given to them, and attention when withdrawn causes the pattern to weaken, and weakened patterns do not dominate, and when patterns that produce incoherence do not dominate, coherence is all that remains, and coherence sustained is mastery, not mastery over the external, mastery over frequency, and frequency determines everything. What does it mean to master frequency? It means to hold one signal consistently enough that the system has no choice but to respond to it. Not to hope it will respond, not to believe it will respond, but to create conditions where response is the only possible outcome, And those conditions are created not through force but through elimination. Elimination of every signal that opposes the desired outcome. Elimination of every thought that contradicts the goal. Elimination of every pattern that scatters attention. And elimination is not suppression. Elimination is the systematic withdrawal of the conditions that sustain the unwanted pattern. And once those conditions are withdrawn, the pattern ceases to operate. Not because you fought it, because it no longer has fuel. And patterns without fuel do not persist. They fade. And when they fade, the aligned pattern is all that remains. And the aligned pattern, when unopposed, operates automatically. An automatic operation produces results that do not require effort. They require only that the frequency remains stable. And frequency remains stable when interference is not introduced. And interference is not introduced when you refuse to feed it. And refusal is how mastery is maintained. Life in coherence does not mean life without challenge. It means life where challenge does not destabilize the system. When the system is coherent, challenges are processed without producing incoherence. Not because the challenges are small, but because the structure is stable. And stable structures do not collapse under pressure. They flex, they adjust, but they do not break, because breaking requires that the structure be weakened, and weakening requires that contradictory frequencies be introduced. And contradictory frequencies are introduced only when old patterns reassert themselves. And old patterns reassert themselves only when they are fed. And they are fed only when attention drifts back to them. And attention drifts back to them only when the new pattern is not yet structural. And the new pattern becomes structural only when it is repeated long enough to become automatic. And automatic is the threshold. Once the aligned pattern is automatic, old patterns stop asserting themselves. Not because they are gone, but because they are no longer fed. And unfed patterns do not compete. They remain dormant. And dormant patterns do not produce interference. And without interference, coherence persists. And persistent coherence is what produces a life where things fall into place. Not occasionally, continuously. Tesla did not live a life free of obstacles. He lived a life where obstacles did not destabilize his frequency. And frequency that remains stable regardless of external conditions is mastery. Not mastery over the external, mastery over the internal. And internal mastery is the only mastery that matters, because the internal determines the external, always, without exception, without delay, and the internal is frequency. And frequency is either aligned or it is not. And if it is aligned and sustained, the external reorganizes to match it, not through magic, through mechanics, the mechanics of resonance, the mechanics of coherence, the mechanics of systems that respond to signal. And signal is what you transmit continuously, not what you say, not what you intend, but what you hold. And what you hold is either coherent or it is not. And if it is coherent, the system produces coherence. And if it is incoherent, the system produces incoherence. And the system does not care which one you prefer. The system responds to what is present. And what is present is determined by frequency. And frequency is determined by structure. And structure is determined by repetition. And repetition is determined by attention. And attention is either aligned or it is not. When frequency is mastered, life does not require management. Life requires only maintenance. And maintenance is not effort. Maintenance is observation. It is the act of noticing when frequency begins to drift and correcting it before the drift becomes structural. And drift is always detectable. It is felt as resistance, as friction, as the sensation that something is off. And when something is off, it is because frequency has shifted. And frequency shifts when attention shifts. And attention shifts when old patterns reassert themselves. And old patterns reassert themselves when they are fed. And they are fed when you forget to redirect. And forgetting to redirect is not failure. It is simply the moment before correction. And correction, when immediate, prevents drift from compounding. And prevented drift is how coherence is maintained indefinitely. Tesla maintained coherence indefinitely. Not because he was perfect, because he corrected immediately. And immediate correction is how mastery becomes permanent, not through dramatic intervention, through continuous precision, precision applied moment to moment, until precision becomes automatic, and automatic precision is indistinguishable from mastery. Life in coherence is not the end of work. It is the beginning of work that does not feel like work, work that feels like expression, work that emerges naturally from the frequency you hold, work that does not require motivation because it is the natural output of an aligned system. And aligned systems do not struggle. They operate, they produce, they express. An expression that comes from coherence is effortless, not because no energy is required, but because no resistance is present. And without resistance, energy converts directly into work. And work that comes from coherence compounds, and compounding produces results that appear extraordinary. But they are not extraordinary. They are the natural outcome of frequency sustained long enough for the system to organize completely around it. And complete organization is not magic. It is mechanics. It is the predictable result of alignment maintained continuously. And continuous alignment is how life transforms from struggle into flow, from effort into expression, from management into maintenance. And maintenance, when the system is coherent, is not burdensome. It is effortless, because the system wants to remain coherent. Coherence is its natural state, and natural states do not require force. They require only that interference remain absent. Master frequency, and everything else becomes automatic. Not because the universe rewards you, but because the system has no other option. When frequency is clear and sustained, the system responds. When the response is coherent, outcomes appear. When outcomes appear consistently, life reorganizes, and reorganized life is life where things fall into place, not through luck, through law, the law of frequency, the law that governs how energy moves, how systems stabilize, and how outcomes emerge. And that law operates whether you understand it or not, whether you believe it or not, whether you align with it or not. But when you align with it, the law works for you, not against you. And working for you means that outcomes appear without force, that results accumulate without struggle, that life becomes the expression of the frequency you hold rather than the battle against circumstances you cannot control. Tesla understood this completely. He did not battle circumstances. He aligned with law, and law, once aligned with, is absolute. It does not fail. It does not waver. It simply operates. And operation, when aligned with law, produces results that do not require explanation. They require only observation. Observation that the system is responding, that the frequency is stable, that coherence is maintained. And maintained coherence is life in its highest form, not life as achievement, life as expression, expression of frequency mastered, frequency sustained, frequency that has become structure, and structure that has become identity. An identity that produces outcomes automatically, because when frequency is mastered, outcomes do not require force. They fall into place, exactly as the law demands. Master frequency, and everything falls into place.